For the first time in history, two mighty fleets clashed without ever seeing each other, yet the sky above the Pacific burned with fire and steel. In May 1942, the vast blue waters of the Pacific became the stage for something the world had never seen before, a battle fought entirely by aircraft carriers, where fleets never sighted each other, yet rained destruction from hundreds of miles apart. This was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier clash in history, and the moment when the tide of war in the Pacific began to shift. It began with Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance. After Pearl Harbor, their empire stretched from Burma to New Guinea, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. Every week brought new victories. Every headline spoke of Allied retreat. But in the shadows of these triumphs, American codebreakers uncovered Japan's next move, a thrust to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, a stepping stone that would bring Japanese bombers within striking range of Australia. If Japan succeeded, the Pacific would tilt entirely in their favor. If they failed, the Allies would gain something precious, breathing space. Two mighty forces set sail. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Navy, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, with carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku at their heart. On the other, the United States Navy, still reeling from losses but determined to fight back, with USS Lexington and USS Yorktown carrying the hopes of a nation. This was not just a battle of ships and planes, but of strategy, intelligence, and raw determination. What followed was chaos in the skies. Torpedo bombers diving through walls of flak, fighters clashing in swirling dogfights above endless waves, and bomb-laden aircraft striking at carriers that could turn the course of the war in minutes. The battle was brutal, costly, and uncertain. Neither side emerged with a clear victory, but for the Allies, simply stopping Japan's advance marked a turning point. It was proof that the Imperial Navy was not invincible, that its expansion could be checked, and that the tide of the Pacific War could at last begin to turn. Tonight we'll dive deep into the entire history of the Battle of the Coral Sea, from the intelligence breakthroughs that set the stage, to the daring strikes that defined carrier warfare, and to the long-term consequences that shaped Midway and beyond. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see people around the world coming together at the same moment, sharing in history's lessons and remembering those who fought on the waves of the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean in 1942 was no longer a tranquil expanse of blue waters separating continents. It had become the central battleground of a global war. In the wake of the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the balance of power in the Pacific tilted sharply in Tokyo's favor. The Imperial Japanese Navy swept through vast territories with startling speed, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. Their momentum seemed unstoppable, with every victory tightening the noose around Allied positions in Asia and the Pacific. The Allies, reeling from shock and disarray, struggled to regroup and comprehend the scale of the threat. Yet in this moment of crisis, the seeds of future resistance were being sown. Strategic planners in Washington, London, and Canberra recognized that halting Japan's advance was vital for the survival of the Allied war effort. The Pacific, once a distant theater, had become the very front line of global survival. Every island, every sea lane, and every outpost now carried strategic weight. It was in this atmosphere of urgency that the stage was set for the coming battle in the Coral Sea. Japan's expansion after Pearl Harbor was not random conquest, but part of a carefully calculated strategy. Their military leaders envisioned a vast defensive perimeter stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, designed to keep Western powers at bay while consolidating their empire. Central to this vision was the domination of key islands and sea routes that would cut off Australia from the United States. If successful, this plan would isolate Allied forces and secure Japan's dominance over Asia and the Pacific. The Coral Sea, lying northeast of Australia, was a crucial link in this chain of expansion. Control of this region would give Japan access to Port Moresby in New Guinea, a base from which they could threaten Australia directly. Such a victory would also disrupt Allied shipping lanes and weaken their capacity to project power across the Pacific. For the Japanese, this was a bold gamble to extend their empire before the industrial might of the United States could fully awaken. For the Allies, it was a stark warning that defeat could come alarmingly close to home. The importance of the Coral Sea was becoming increasingly clear to both sides. The Allied response to Japan's rapid successes was initially reactive and fragmented, but determination soon began to replace shock. American industry mobilized at a furious pace, with shipyards producing carriers, destroyers, and planes in numbers unimaginable just months earlier. Britain, though battered by war in Europe, lent strategic expertise and resources to support the Pacific theater. Australia and New Zealand, directly threatened by Japanese moves, became indispensable partners in the effort to hold the line. The Coral Sea was not just another stretch of ocean, it was the lifeline connecting Australia with American reinforcements and supplies. If severed, Australia would stand exposed, vulnerable to invasion or forced into isolation. This reality transformed the Coral Sea from an obscure maritime zone into one of the most important theaters of the war. Every Allied decision in early 1942 was shaped by the urgency of keeping supply routes open. Military planners knew that even a limited Japanese victory here could reshape the balance of power. The Allies had no choice but to stand and fight. Pearl Harbor had revealed the vulnerability of battleships, and the new era of carrier warfare was dawning. The aircraft carrier, once considered a supporting vessel, now emerged as the decisive weapon of the Pacific. Planes could strike hundreds of miles from their carriers, eliminating the need for direct ship-to-ship combat. This revolution in naval warfare meant that the Coral Sea battle would be fought not by cannons and armor, but by aircraft launched from distant decks. For the first time in history, two opposing fleets would clash without ever coming within visual range of each other. This innovation was as terrifying as it was unprecedented, with success hinging on scouting, timing, and aerial superiority. American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, Lexington, and Yorktown became symbols of hope, standing as the fragile barrier against Japan's expansion. The Japanese, with their carriers Shōkaku, Zuikaku, and light carrier Shuko, believed their air wings would ensure swift victory. Both sides were preparing for a type of battle no admiral in history had ever commanded. The Coral Sea was about to become the proving ground of this new naval age. Strategically, the Coral Sea was not just about geography, but about momentum. Japan sought to maintain the initiative, pressing its advantage before the United States could fully recover. Every conquest since December had emboldened Tokyo and humiliated the Allies, fueling propaganda that painted Japan as invincible. Yet, beneath the triumph, Japanese planners knew time was against them. America's vast industrial capacity, once mobilized, could produce warships, planes, and weapons faster than Japan could ever hope to match. Thus, the Coral Sea offensive was not merely expansion, but a desperate attempt to lock in strategic superiority while the opportunity remained. The Allies understood this dynamic as well, recognizing that halting Japan here would be a blow not only to its military, but to its aura of invincibility. The battle to come would be about more than ships and planes. It would be a struggle over perception, morale, and the future direction of the war. Whoever controlled the Coral Sea would control the psychological momentum of the Pacific. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of nations. The Coral Sea's importance also extended to the civilian world, particularly Australia, with Japan's capture of Rabaul and moves toward New Guinea. Australians' feared invasion was imminent. Cities such as Sydney and Brisbane braced for the worst, with citizens digging trenches and rehearsing air raid drills. Politically, Australian leaders pleaded with Washington and London for reinforcements, knowing that abandonment would leave them exposed. The United States, aware of Australia's importance as a base for Pacific operations, committed to its defence. Thus, the Coral Sea became more than a battle between fleets. It became the shield protecting an entire continent. If Japan succeeded in isolating or occupying Australia, the Allied war effort in the Pacific would collapse. Beyond strategy, the human element was equally vital, as soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike felt the weight of coming events. Hope and fear intertwined, each decision echoing through both military and civilian lives. The Coral Sea was now more than water. It was the dividing line between survival and disaster. The forces preparing for confrontation in the Coral Sea came from very different worlds, but shared the same destiny of collision. The Japanese fleet, drilled in precision and buoyed by victories, believed their skill and discipline would prevail. American crews, though less experienced, carried determination and a growing confidence in their aircraft and leadership. The Australians, often overlooked, stood ready to defend their homeland with grit and sacrifice. Each side viewed the battle as pivotal, though for different reasons. Japan saw it as expansion, the Allies as survival. Technology, tactics, and timing would all play their part, but so too would human courage and improvisation. The Coral Sea thus became a stage where the clash of empires would be fought not only with steel and fire, but with willpower. Every pilot, sailor, and commander stepping into this arena knew history was being written with their actions. The Pacific was vast, but its fate would soon hinge on one corner of ocean. Destiny was pulling both navies toward a meeting neither could avoid. As May 1942 approached, all eyes turned to the Coral Sea, though few outside the highest levels of command fully grasped its significance. For the Japanese, it was the key to completing their southern perimeter and intimidating Australia. For the Allies, it was the chance to draw a line in the sand and prove that Japan's advance could be checked. In the waters northeast of Australia, the world's first great carrier battle was about to unfold. The outcome would resonate far beyond the Pacific, influencing global strategy and morale. Every ship steaming toward the battle zone carried not only weapons, but the hopes and fears of nations. What lay ahead was unprecedented. Fleets maneuvering by unseen hand, aircraft clashing high above, and history pivoting in the skies. The Coral Sea would be remembered as the first time carriers faced carriers, setting the stage for modern naval warfare. But in 1942, no one knew how it would end, only that everything depended on it. The Pacific at a crossroads was about to reveal its verdict. In the early months of 1942, Imperial Japan seemed unstoppable, carving a path of conquest across the Pacific with precision and ferocity. Their expansion stretched from the Philippines to Malaya, from Singapore to the Dutch East Indies, securing vital oil, rubber, and raw materials. Yet their ambitions did not end there, for Japanese planners envisioned a southern thrust that would sever Allied lines of communication and isolate Australia. The island continent represented not only a threat to Japan's perimeter, but also a potential springboard for future Allied counterattacks. By striking southward into New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Tokyo sought to strangle Australia's connection with the United States. Port Moresby in New Guinea became the immediate objective, as control of this base would allow Japan to dominate sea lanes across the Coral Sea. This was not mere territorial ambition, but a carefully calculated strategy to deny the Allies any foothold close to Japanese conquests. Each move southward was designed to tighten the noose, leaving Australia cut off and vulnerable. The advance promised not only strategic depth, but also psychological dominance over Allied populations. Japan's empire was reaching outward, and the Coral Sea stood directly in its path. The Japanese strategy was shaped by both opportunity and necessity, as the empire's victories came with immense logistical demands. Securing resources from the conquered territories required control over vast maritime routes that stretched thousands of miles. Without mastery of these sea lanes, their empire would be unsustainable, vulnerable to interdiction by Allied naval forces. This made the South Pacific not just a battleground, but the lifeline of Japan's war effort. From Rabaul in New Britain, which had fallen to Japanese forces in January 1942, they established a powerful forward base. Rabaul became the staging ground for operations aimed at New Guinea and the Solomons, a hub from which fleets, planes, and troops could be dispatched southward. With airfields under construction and a sheltered anchorage, Rabaul became the heart of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. From this stronghold, Port Moresby was only a short leap away, and beyond it lay the vulnerable coastline of Australia. Japanese planners believed that with one decisive stroke, they could isolate their southern rival. The Coral Sea thus became the gateway through which Japan sought to secure its empire and impose its will. At the core of Japan's expansion plan was the desire to create a defensive perimeter that would shield the empire from counterattack. Their military doctrine emphasized securing outer rings of islands that could serve as bastions against Allied advances. By extending control into the Solomons and New Guinea, Japan would force the Allies to fight across vast distances, stretching supply lines and resources thin. Port Moresby, perched on the southern coast of New Guinea, was the crown jewel of this strategy. With it in their hands, Japanese bombers could strike northern Australia, while naval forces could dominate the Coral Sea. This would sever critical supply lines from the United States, turning Australia into an isolated outpost unable to aid Allied operations. Moreover, possession of these territories would provide staging grounds for future offensives deeper into the Pacific. Each conquest was meant to lock in Japanese dominance before America's industrial machine could reach full strength. Time as much as territory was the enemy, and Japanese commanders knew they had to strike swiftly. Their plans were bold, but the risks of overextension loomed ever larger. The Japanese viewed Australia as both a threat and an opportunity, though a full-scale invasion was never a realistic option. Instead, their goal was to neutralize Australia's usefulness as an Allied base, cutting it off from American reinforcements. By controlling New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japan could effectively sever supply lines, turning Australia into a strategic dead end. This approach reflected Japan's broader philosophy of controlling choke points rather than overextending with direct occupations. Yet the psychological impact on Australia was profound, with fears of invasion running rampant across the continent. Civilians dug trenches, trained for air raids, and prepared for a war that seemed to be closing in on their shores. Japanese propaganda exploited these fears, boasting of inevitable domination and presenting themselves as masters of the Pacific. The Coral Sea became the invisible wall between Australia and encroaching Japanese power. If that wall were breached, Australia's isolation would be complete. The battle lines were being drawn not only in geography, but in the minds of millions. Operationally, The expansion into the South Pacific required coordination between Japan's Navy, Army, and Air Force. The Imperial Japanese Navy carried the burden of projecting power across the ocean, with carriers, cruisers, and destroyers leading the way. Amphibious units prepared to land at Port Moresby, while other forces targeted Tulagi in the Solomon Islands for a seaplane base. These operations were designed to work in tandem, establishing a network of outposts that would reinforce one another. The Japanese army, meanwhile, supplied troops and garrisons to hold captured territories and secure airfields. Coordination was not always seamless, as rivalries between services complicated planning, yet the momentum of victories masked inefficiencies. The Coral Sea campaign thus became a test not only of Allied resistance, but of Japan's ability to sustain joint operations over immense distances. Their confidence stemmed from earlier triumphs, but the stakes here were far higher. Success would solidify their empire. Failure could expose their vulnerabilities. The weight of this gamble pressed heavily on every ship and every soldier moving southward. The choice of Port Moresby as the immediate target reflected both geography and strategy. Its location on the southern coast of New Guinea provided a natural springboard for Japanese aircraft to dominate northern Australia. Control of this base would also give them command of the Coral Sea, blocking Allied movement between Australia and the Pacific. From there, Japanese forces could threaten Fiji, Samoa, and even deeper Allied positions in the South Pacific. The capture of Port Moresby would not only secure Japan's perimeter, but also push the front line far closer to Allied homelands. For Australian leaders, this threat was existential, as the loss of Port Moresby would leave their northern approaches wide open. The Coral Sea became the battlefield that would decide whether this plan succeeded or failed. Japanese planners, emboldened by months of unchecked victories, believed success was assured, yet they underestimated the growing resolve of the Allies, who had deciphered enough intelligence to anticipate the coming strike. The stage was set for a clash unlike any the Pacific had yet seen. The Solomon Islands also figured prominently in Japan's designs, as bases that would extend their reconnaissance and strike range. Tulagi, a small island near Guadalcanal, was targeted for a seaplane base that could patrol vast swaths of ocean. This installation would enhance Japan's ability to monitor Allied movements and protect their advancing fleet. The occupation of Tulagi in early May 1942 marked the opening moves of the Coral Sea campaign. Though small in scale, it symbolized the creeping advance of Japanese power southward. From these islands, Japan could project control over critical shipping lanes and encircle Australia with a tightening web of bases. The Solomons thus became both a shield and a spear in Japan's expanding empire. For the Allies, this represented an alarming escalation that demanded immediate response. Tulagi was the warning shot, and Port Moresby the looming danger. Every island seized brought the confrontation closer to the breaking point. By early May 1942, the Japanese believed their southern thrust was poised for swift success, but their confidence masked vulnerabilities. Their fleets were stretched across enormous distances, from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, leaving gaps in reconnaissance and supply. Overconfidence also bred complacency, as they underestimated Allied intelligence and resilience. Yet for all these weaknesses, the Japanese advance carried the aura of inevitability, built on a string of decisive victories. The Coral Sea became the critical test of whether their empire could keep expanding or whether the tide would finally turn. For the Allies, this was not simply a naval battle, but a fight for survival in the Pacific. Australia's fate, the security of supply lines, and the momentum of the war all converged in this narrow theatre of ocean. Every move southward by Japan tightened the stakes, forcing a confrontation that could no longer be delayed. The Coral Sea was where the myth of Japanese invincibility would be challenged. The next chapter in the Pacific War was about to erupt in fire and steel. Port Moresby, nestled on the southern coast of New Guinea, became the focal point of Japan's southern advance in 1942. Its geography made it uniquely valuable, positioned at the edge of the Coral Sea and facing directly toward northern Australia. For Japan, capturing Port Moresby meant creating a launch pad for aerial strikes against Australian cities and military installations. This would put Darwin, Townsville, and even Brisbane within range of Japanese bombers, threatening to paralyze Australia's infrastructure. More importantly, control of the port would enable Japan to dominate the shipping routes, linking Australia with the United States. Without those supply lines, Australia's ability to act as a staging ground for Allied offensives would collapse. Japanese planners envisioned the seizure of Port Moresby as the linchpin of a grand defensive perimeter stretching across the Pacific. It was not just a tactical gain but a strategic masterstroke, promising to cripple Allied logistics and morale simultaneously. The Allies knew its loss would expose Australia like an open wound. Thus, the fate of the Pacific War hinged on this seemingly modest harbour. For the Allies, Port Moresby represented more than a dot on the map. It was a lifeline in the struggle to hold the Pacific. From its airfields, Allied reconnaissance planes could sweep the Coral Sea, tracking Japanese movements across vast waters. Its harbour offered a safe anchorage for convoys moving between the US and Australia, protecting supply ships from U-boat-style interdiction. With Port Moresby intact, Australia could continue to serve as a fortress and springboard for future offensives. If it fell, however, the Allies would be pushed thousands of miles back, scrambling to defend supply lines from more distant bases. The loss would sever American reinforcements, leaving Australia dangerously exposed to encirclement. In strategic terms, Port Moresby was the hinge upon which Allied survival turned in the South Pacific. The Japanese recognized this with clarity, pressing to seize it before the Allies could regroup after Pearl Harbor. Every convoy, every air sortie, every reinforcement in the theater was linked to the security of Port Moresby. It became the chessboard square upon which the game of the Pacific War was balanced. The Japanese plan to seize Port Moresby was born from both ambition and necessity. After the stunning victories of late 1941 and early 1942, Tokyo sought to consolidate its gains by creating a shield of fortified outposts. Port Moresby's capture would complete a southern arc of defense that stretched from Burma to the Solomons. Once secured, it would allow Japan to isolate Australia and force it into strategic irrelevance. This move was not just about weakening Australia, but also about cutting the Allies off from a future counter-offensive. Japan's naval command, under Admiral Yamamoto, believed that seizing Port Moresby would remove the last immediate threat to their empire. It was also seen as a means of buying time before American industry could overwhelm the Pacific with new fleets. With Port Moresby under their control, Japan could claim a position of strength in any negotiation or long-term conflict. The small coastal settlement thus became a target of disproportionate importance. The stage was set for confrontation over a harbour few outside the region had ever heard of before the war. Geography was the silent partner in this struggle, dictating the importance of Port Moresby with unyielding clarity. The Coral Sea, stretching between Australia and New Guinea, formed a vital maritime highway. Whoever controlled its northern shore controlled the sea lanes that carried reinforcements, supplies and food to Australia. From Port Moresby, Japanese aircraft could dominate this highway, rendering it too dangerous for Allied convoys. The base's airfields provided the range necessary to intercept and destroy ships before they reached safety. Conversely, Allied possession of Port Moresby allowed them to harass Japanese shipping lines and protect their own. It was a natural fulcrum in the geography of the South Pacific, a point where the balance of power could tip in either direction. Its rugged coastline and mountain backdrop offered natural defenses, while its harbor gave easy access to the open sea. No other site in the region combined these advantages in such measure. Geography alone made Port Moresby indispensable. The psychological dimension of Port Moresby's importance cannot be overstated. For Australians, its fall would bring the enemy to their doorstep, igniting fears of invasion across the continent. Though Japan never planned a full-scale invasion of Australia, the capture of Port Moresby would have created the illusion that such a move was imminent. This fear could have shattered civilian morale and disrupted military planning, weakening Allied resolve. Propaganda on both sides emphasized the stakes, with Japan boasting of its inevitable dominance and the Allies framing the defense as a fight for survival. Newspapers carried daily updates, turning Port Moresby into a household name across the English-speaking world. The city became a symbol of resistance for Australians, embodying their determination to stand firm against overwhelming odds. For Japan, its capture promised to prove their invincibility and intimidate the Allies into submission. The psychological battlefield was as fierce as the physical one. In both hearts and minds, Port Moresby became a decisive prize. From a military planning perspective, the Japanese approach to Port Moresby demonstrated their evolving strategy in 1942. They aimed to capture it not through a direct naval assault on Australia, but via amphibious landings in New Guinea. Supported by carrier-based aircraft, these landings would overwhelm the lightly defended Allied garrison. At the same time, Japanese seaplane bases in the Solomons, such as Tulagi, would provide reconnaissance and forward support. This multifaceted approach reflected Japan's understanding of combined operations across sea, air, and land. Yet it also revealed the growing strain on their forces, as every new conquest demanded garrisons, fuel, and logistical networks. The Port Moresby campaign thus became a gamble, stretching resources while promising immense rewards. If successful, it would anchor Japan's empire. If it failed, it would expose dangerous vulnerabilities. This gamble would ultimately define the battle that erupted in the Coral Sea. Japan's strategic brilliance and overconfidence collided in equal measure. For the Allies, defending Port Moresby required both resolve and coordination. American naval forces, under Admiral Chester Nimitz, recognized that losing it would cripple any hope of holding Australia. Reinforcements were dispatched, and carrier groups were mobilized to intercept the Japanese thrust. Australian ground troops prepared defensive positions, aware they stood as the last barrier before their homeland. Intelligence from codebreakers provided critical insight into Japan's plans, giving the Allies an advantage they desperately needed. The defense of Port Moresby became not just an Australian concern, but a joint Allied effort involving the United States and Britain. Every convoy sent, every pilot trained, every ship deployed was tied to the defense of this single location. It symbolized the new era of coalition warfare, where the fate of nations hinged on unity. The Coral Sea was the proving ground for this cooperation. Port Moresby became the rallying point for Allied determination. In the end, Port Moresby's importance can only be understood as the convergence of strategy, geography, and symbolism. It was a harbor, an airfield, a fortress, and a symbol of survival all in one. For Japan, it was the key to isolating Australia and cementing their empire. For the Allies, it was the anchor that held the line against relentless expansion. Its capture would have reshaped the Pacific War, but its defense marked the beginning of Japan's limits. Port Moresby became a symbol of the turning tide, a reminder that geography and determination could halt even the mightiest aggressors. The coming battle would prove that small places can carry enormous consequences. In the struggle for Port Moresby, the Pacific found its crossroads. The Coral Sea would soon ignite in battle, and the world would witness history's first great carrier clash. At its heart was a harbour whose name became legend. The defence of the Coral Sea and the protection of Port Moresby rested squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. Navy's High Command. At the top was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, whose calm demeanour masked a relentless will to adapt and overcome. Nimitz had inherited a shattered fleet after Pearl Harbor, yet he transformed chaos into a coordinated effort. His genius lay not only in naval tactics, but in his ability to integrate intelligence, logistics, and strategy into a cohesive whole. Facing an enemy that had won victory after victory, Nimitz understood that Allied survival depended on decisive action. He knew that the Coral Sea was not just another battle, but a test of America's ability to halt Japanese momentum. Beneath him, the task of operational command would fall to men like Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher, though sometimes criticized by historians, carried the weight of commanding the carriers Yorktown and Lexington into the unknown. With limited resources and untested tactics, these leaders would attempt to match the experience of Japan's naval aviators. The Coral Sea would be their proving ground, and history would judge their every move. Nimitz's leadership was rooted in pragmatism and quiet confidence. He was not a flamboyant figure, nor did he rely on grandiose rhetoric. Instead, he built his reputation on methodical planning and trust in his subordinates. Nimitz believed in the importance of calculated risks, understanding that waiting too long would allow Japan to cement its dominance. He worked tirelessly to ensure that American carriers damaged or strained were ready for battle sooner than expected. Yorktown, hastily repaired after earlier engagements, stood as a testament to his insistence on rapid readiness. Nimitz also valued intelligence above all else, recognizing it as America's secret advantage in a war of attrition. By relying on Station Hypio's codebreakers, he gained insight into Japan's intentions long before his enemy suspected. This reliance on intelligence marked a revolution in naval warfare, shifting from guesswork to informed decision-making. In the Coral Sea, Nimitz's reliance on intelligence would give the Allies a fighting chance. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17, was the man chosen to translate Nimitz's strategy into action. Fletcher was a veteran of surface warfare, not a carrier specialist, and this fact later drew criticism from some quarters. Yet in 1942, there were precious few admirals with combat experience, and Fletcher had proven himself under fire. He commanded the Yorktown, a vital centerpiece of the fleet, with the Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch operating alongside. Fletcher's cautious nature reflected the enormous responsibility he bore, for the loss of even one carrier could cripple Allied capacity in the Pacific. He was forced to balance aggression with prudence, striking hard at the Japanese without exposing his forces to annihilation. His decisions were made under relentless pressure, with limited intelligence, erratic weather, and the constant threat of Japanese attack. Fletcher's leadership was not flawless, but it was marked by determination and adaptability. In the Coral Sea, he would orchestrate the first carrier versus carrier clash in history. The burden of command weighed heavily, yet Fletcher accepted it without hesitation. Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, Fletcher's subordinate, commanded the Lexington, and played a vital role in shaping the fleet's air operations. Fitch was more familiar with carrier aviation than Fletcher, bringing balance to the command structure. He coordinated closely with Fletcher, while offering insights into the capabilities and limitations of carrier-based aircraft. The coordination between Yorktown and Lexington's air groups demanded precise timing and trust. In these early days of carrier warfare, doctrines were still being written in the heat of battle. Fletcher's calm confidence inspired aviators who faced daunting odds against Japan's elite airmen. His ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, such as weather and scattered intelligence reports, proved invaluable. Fletcher leaned on Fitch's expertise, though the pressures of time often forced rushed decisions. Together, their cooperation exemplified the teamwork required to hold the line. The Coral Sea demanded not only courage, but also unity, and Fitch's contribution strengthened that fragile unity. At the heart of Allied command was the revolutionary use of intelligence, orchestrated by Nimitz and his staff. Station HE-PO in Hawaii, led by Joseph Rochefort, had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to uncover Japan's intentions. This breakthrough revealed that Japan was preparing a thrust into the Coral Sea aimed at Port Moresby. Nimitz and Fletcher were thus able to position carriers in advance, transforming intelligence into action. Never before had intelligence played such a pivotal role in shaping a naval engagement. Nimitz trusted Rochefort's analysis, even when other officers doubted its accuracy. The decision to act on this information marked a turning point in naval strategy, proving that cryptanalysis could alter the tide of war. Fletcher's forces sailed with confidence, knowing they were not blindly searching, but waiting in ambush. Intelligence bridged the gap between Allied weakness and Japanese strength. In the Coral Sea, the ability to anticipate the enemy was as valuable as the strength of any battleship. The coordination between US Navy Command and Australian forces also added a crucial layer to the Allied response. Australia, facing the direct threat of invasion, provided air bases, reconnaissance, and logistical support. Communication lines between Nimitz's Pacific Command and General Douglas MacArthur's forces in Australia were often strained, but the urgency of Port Moresby's defence forced cooperation. Fletcher's fleet relied on Australian reconnaissance planes to track Japanese movements across New Guinea and the Coral Sea. This cooperation demonstrated the growing Allied coalition, blending American naval power with Australian resolve. It also revealed the challenges of multinational command, where cultural differences and competing priorities had to be managed. Nevertheless, the Allies recognized that only through unity could Japan be stopped. Fletcher's carriers and Australian bases formed a single defensive shield over the Coral Sea. This partnership foreshadowed the greater coalition that would eventually reclaim the Pacific. The Coral Sea was both a battle and a rehearsal for future Allied cooperation. The US Navy in 1942 was still adapting to a new style of warfare centered on aircraft carriers. Fletcher, Fitch, and their air group commanders were writing doctrine in real time, testing theories against Japan's formidable experience. Unlike the Japanese, who had honed carrier tactics through years of exercises, the Americans entered the Coral Sea with less preparation. Yet what they lacked in experience, they compensated for with daring innovation and courage. Fletcher had to trust his aviators to find and strike the enemy without direct oversight. Communications were limited, forcing commanders to delegate responsibility to squadron leaders in the heat of battle. This decentralization created risks, but also fostered initiative among pilots and officers. The Coral Sea became a crucible where American naval aviation began to prove itself against the best in the world. The decisions made by Fletcher and his staff would define not only the battle, but the future of carrier warfare. In every sense, They were pioneers operating at the edge of uncertainty. In retrospect, the leadership of Nimitz, Fletcher, and Fitch at the Coral Sea revealed the qualities essential for victory in modern warfare. Nimitz's calm reliance on intelligence gave the Allies a decisive edge before the first shot was fired. Fletcher's steady, if cautious hand provided cohesion to the fleet under unprecedented conditions. Fitch's expertise in carrier aviation ensured that the fleet's striking power was maximized despite limited numbers. Together, they formed a triad of command that balanced strategy, caution, and daring. Their cooperation reflected the evolving character of the U.S. Navy, shifting from battleship tradition to the age of the aircraft carrier. Though their actions were imperfect, they were sufficient to meet the moment. The Coral Sea was not won solely by firepower, but by leadership willing to take risks under immense pressure. Nimitz's vision, Fletcher's responsibility, and Fitch's adaptability shaped the outcome of history's first carrier clash. The Allied command had found its rhythm, and with it, the seeds of eventual victory were sown. At the center of Japan's Pacific strategy in 1942 stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, a brilliant naval officer and strategist. Yamamoto was both admired and feared within Japanese circles for his boldness and independence. Though he had opposed war with the United States initially, once committed, he demanded that Japan strike decisively to secure its empire. Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial base was dwarfed by America's, making quick victories essential. He therefore sought to expand Japan's defensive perimeter as far as possible, stretching Allied supply lines and protecting the homeland. The Coral Sea region, including New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, became a vital link in this expansion. Yamamoto envisioned Japanese control of Port Moresby as a dagger pointed directly at Australia, cutting its ties to the United States. Such control would also shield Japanese bases at Rabaul and Truk from southern attacks. His ambitions were not merely military, but psychological, designed to demoralize the Allies and force negotiations. The Coral Sea, then, became a stage for Yamamoto's vision of dominance. Yamamoto's leadership style combined meticulous planning with daring improvisation. He valued intelligence and surprise, seeking to outmaneuver opponents with bold strikes rather than protracted battles. This approach had already been demonstrated at Pearl Harbor, where his daring had temporarily crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Now he turned his eyes southward, convinced that further aggression would secure Japan's conquests. Yamamoto believed that the capture of Port Moresby would isolate Australia and potentially remove it from the war effort. To achieve this, he devised Operation MO, a carefully planned assault on the Coral Sea. This operation called for a complex coordination of carrier forces, invasion convoys, and land-based air support. Though intricate, Yamamoto believed that Japanese superiority in training and equipment would ensure success. His confidence reflected Japan's string of victories across Asia and the Pacific, which had gone largely unchallenged. In his mind, the Coral Sea was another stepping stone toward Japan's defensive empire. Operation MO represented a critical shift in Japanese naval thinking. No longer were they merely defending their gains. Now they sought to push the Allied line back to its furthest limit. The plan involved two primary components: the invasion of Port Moresby by a convoy and the covering presence of carriers to eliminate Allied interference. Yamamoto entrusted operational command to Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, who oversaw the Fourth Fleet. Supporting him were seasoned carrier commanders such as Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi and Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara. The Japanese assembled a powerful force, including the fleet carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku, symbols of naval might. They believed that this fleet could not only secure Port Moresby, but also destroy whatever remnants of Allied naval power dared intervene. Japanese planners underestimated the speed with which the Americans could deploy their carriers. They also failed to grasp the extent of Allied code-breaking that compromised their secrecy. These miscalculations would eventually prove costly, but at this stage, confidence was supreme. Yamamoto's ambitions were shaped not only by military necessity, but also by political pressure. Within the Japanese high command, Army and Navy leaders often clashed over priorities. The Army was focused on China and Southeast Asia, while Yamamoto pressed for dominance in the Pacific. He argued that controlling the seas was essential to protecting Japan's territorial gains. To achieve this, he insisted that carriers play the decisive role in naval campaigns, eclipsing the traditional dominance of battleships. This view was not universally accepted within the Navy, where older admirals clung to surface engagements. Yamamoto's Coral Sea strategy therefore also became a test of the new doctrine of carrier warfare. His insistence on aggressive expansion aimed to prove the effectiveness of naval aviation. Political leaders in Tokyo, flush with victories, supported his daring plans. For Yamamoto, success in the Coral Sea would validate both his vision and Japan's naval supremacy. The Japanese command structure for Operation MO was complex and ambitious. Admiral Inoue operated from Rabaul, orchestrating the invasion force with the assistance of land-based aircraft. Takagi's carrier strike force, featuring Shōkaku and Zuikaku, would shield the invasion fleet and seek out enemy carriers. Hara, as air group commander, was tasked with ensuring the precision and ferocity of aerial strikes. Supporting these forces were cruisers, destroyers, and smaller carriers such as Shoho, which would escort the invasion convoy. The plan relied heavily on synchronized timing, with carriers neutralizing Allied resistance as convoys advanced. Yamamoto expected the Allies to react slowly, underestimating their recovery after Pearl Harbor. He also assumed that Japanese pilots, hardened by victories in the Philippines and Java Sea, would dominate the skies. In reality, the margin of superiority was narrower than anticipated. Coordination problems and unexpected resistance would soon reveal cracks in Japanese confidence. Yet, at the outset, the Japanese commanders exuded certainty in their plan's success. Yamamoto's ambitions in the Coral Sea extended beyond immediate conquest. He saw this operation as preparation for the larger showdown he anticipated at Midway. The capture of Port Moresby would secure Japan's southern flank and free resources for further offensives. By projecting power deep into the Coral Sea, Yamamoto also sought to draw out and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers. His long-term vision was to annihilate the American fleet in a decisive battle, forcing Washington to the negotiating table. Thus, the Coral Sea was not simply about Australia, but about creating conditions for the grand strategy to unfold. Yamamoto understood that time was not on Japan's side, for American industrial might loomed on the horizon. Every victory delayed that reckoning and bought Japan precious months of dominance. The Coral Sea therefore became both a tactical objective and a strategic stepping stone. Yamamoto's ambition, however, risked overextending Japan's forces at the very moment they appeared strongest. The Japanese commanders beneath Yamamoto displayed loyalty but also expressed quiet concerns. In Midway, directing from Rabaul, doubted whether Japan could sustain such rapid expansions without stretching logistics thin. Takagi, commanding the carriers, worried about the potential for unexpected enemy resistance. Hara, though confident in his aviators, understood the risks of attrition in protracted battles. Yet none openly challenged Yamamoto's vision, for his authority within the fleet was unmatched. His reputation as the architect of Pearl Harbor gave him near-mythical stature among officers. Midway and others adapted their doubts into contingency plans, but these remained secondary to Yamamoto's drive. This dynamic revealed the centralized nature of Japanese command, where boldness often overshadowed caution. While unity of purpose gave Japan strength, it also reduced flexibility in the face of setbacks. The Coral Sea would test whether loyalty and boldness could compensate for strategic overreach. It would also reveal the limits of Yamamoto's towering ambitions. In retrospect, Yamamoto's ambitions in the Coral Sea reflected both brilliance and fatal flaw. He recognized the necessity of seizing the initiative and striking hard before American power grew overwhelming. His plan combined audacity, coordination, and the belief in Japan's qualitative superiority. Yet it also underestimated Allied resilience, intelligence breakthroughs, and the fragility of Japan's own logistical networks. By pushing south toward Port Moresby, Yamamoto exposed his carriers to risks in unfamiliar waters. His commanders executed his orders with determination, but their confidence masked vulnerability. The Coral Sea would ultimately prove that ambition alone could not guarantee success against a determined foe. Yamamoto's vision had propelled Japan to the brink of strategic greatness, but it also led toward the first major naval check of the war. The clash ahead would test his theories of naval dominance. In the Coral Sea, Yamamoto's ambitions collided with the harsh realities of modern warfare. While Japanese admirals believed their plans for the Coral Sea were shielded in secrecy, an unseen battle of intellect and perseverance was unfolding in Hawaii. At Pearl Harbor, in a nondescript building known as Station High-PO, American cryptographers labored tirelessly to crack Japan's naval codes. Their work centered on JN-25, a complex cipher system used by the Imperial Japanese Navy for strategic communications. Each intercepted message was a puzzle of numbers and meaningless groups, concealing vital operational intentions. For months, American codebreakers sifted through fragments, building dictionaries of code groups, and applying painstaking statistical analysis. The task demanded brilliance, patience, and a willingness to live in monotony, staring at endless strings of digits. These cryptographers were not warriors with rifles or pilots in cockpits, but their role was no less decisive. At the head of this effort stood Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant but eccentric officer whose team labored in obscurity. Their work would soon uncover secrets that shifted the balance in the Pacific. The path to victory at Coral Sea began not with torpedoes, but with code-breaking pens and typewriters. Rochefort's team was small, underfunded, and often overlooked by higher command in Washington. Yet within Station Haipuo, a sense of urgency pulsed through every desk and every intercepted message. The team, composed of mathematicians, linguists, and even crossword enthusiasts, attacked Japanese ciphers with relentless energy. Each breakthrough came not from machines but from human intuition, pattern recognition, and the dogged pursuit of small consistencies. They slowly pieced together traffic patterns that revealed Japanese intentions without reading entire messages. By early 1942, their efforts began to produce usable intelligence, narrowing down areas of Japanese operations. What might have seemed like a random flurry of numbers now revealed the outlines of a grand strategy. Station Haipuo's analysts could see Japanese movements stretching across the Pacific like the threads of a spider's web. In this web lay a plan to strike southward into the Coral Sea. The cryptographers' unseen battle was beginning to pay off. The intelligence breakthrough hinged on more than just mathematics. It was also about imagination. Rochefort and his men learned to think like their opponents, predicting how Japanese officers might structure communications. They noted repeated code groups that suggested references to bases, convoys, and carriers. Through painstaking work, they reconstructed enough of JN-25 to identify specific operations. In April 1942, they began intercepting messages that hinted at a Japanese operation designated MO. The cryptographers deciphered enough context to understand that Port Moresby was the target. This revelation was monumental, as it gave the Allies advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions. Suddenly, the battle was no longer a guessing game but a contest fought with foresight. Codebreaking provided an edge that raw firepower alone could not. For the first time, the Allies would enter battle armed with knowledge rather than surprise. The US Navy's ability to exploit intelligence marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Instead of reacting blindly to enemy advances, Admiral Chester Nimitz could now anticipate them. Armed with Rochefort's decrypts, Nimitz knew Japan's fleet movements days before they occurred. He could position carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to intercept the Japanese with calculated precision. Intelligence also revealed the timing of Japanese convoys and the presence of their carriers. This meant that American forces could avoid walking into traps and instead set ambushes of their own. The Coral Sea was the first major battle where signals intelligence directly shaped strategy. Without code breaking, the US carriers might have been caught unprepared and overwhelmed. With it, they could meet the Japanese on far more even terms. In this sense, cryptographers became silent partners to admirals and sailors at sea. The cryptographer's achievement was not without challenges. JN-25 was not a single code but a layered system of codebooks and additive keys, constantly updated by the Japanese. Every change threatened to undo weeks of progress, forcing HYPU to rebuild its dictionaries from scratch. To keep up, Rochefort's team worked in shifts, day and night, in rooms filled with cigarette smoke and the clatter of typewriters. Their living conditions were austere, but their sense of mission was unshakable. Each small breakthrough carried with it a thrill of discovery, as if pulling back the curtain on enemy secrets. They endured skepticism from some naval commanders who distrusted paper intelligence, yet their accuracy in predicting Japanese moves gradually silenced doubters. By May 1942, their decrypts left no doubt Japan was moving south toward Port Moresby. The fate of the Coral Sea would hinge on their work. Rochefort's leadership style was unconventional, but it fostered creativity. He allowed his team members freedom to experiment with unorthodox methods, trusting intuition as much as logic. His eccentricities, wearing a smoking jacket at work, walking barefoot across the office, set him apart from traditional officers. But his genius lay in cultivating a culture where mistakes were tolerated as stepping stones to insight. This culture proved essential in unraveling JN-25's complexity. His team became a family of sorts, united by exhaustion, secrecy, and pride in their mission. Few outside HYPU knew the importance of their contribution, but inside they understood they were shaping history. Their satisfaction came from watching Nimitz act decisively on their intelligence. For once, America would not be surprised at sea. Instead, it was the Japanese who would sail into a trap of their own making. The intelligence breakthrough at Pearl Harbor also carried psychological weight. For months, Americans had lived under the shadow of Japanese superiority after Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines. Every defeat had been marked by shock and helplessness. Now, at last, there was evidence that the enemy could be anticipated and countered. This knowledge restored confidence at the highest levels of command. Nimitz himself later admitted that intelligence gave him the courage to take risks he otherwise would not have dared. Knowing where and when the Japanese would strike allowed him to concentrate limited resources with maximum effect. It also gave American sailors a hidden ally, the certainty that their movements were not random, but guided by secret foresight. The sense of control in a chaotic war was a priceless advantage. The Coral Sea battle thus became as much a triumph of minds as of machines. In retrospect, the work at Station Heap Hall during the lead-up to Coral Sea was a prelude to even greater successes. The same techniques would later enable the ambush at Midway, turning the tide of the Pacific War, but Coral Sea was the first true test of intelligence-led strategy. Without Rochefort's cryptographers, the Japanese would likely have achieved their objectives in Port Moresby. With them, the Allies could contest control of the South Pacific at a crucial juncture. The Codebreakers' contribution went largely unrecognized during the war, buried beneath layers of secrecy, yet their fingerprints were on every maneuver and every decision in May 1942. In the battle to come, pilots, sailors, and carriers would fight in thunderous clashes above and below the waves. But in quiet rooms at Pearl Harbor, the first blows had already been struck. Intelligence had given the Allies a fighting chance in the Coral Sea. As the Coral Sea campaign approached, both Japan and the Allies marshaled their naval strength for a confrontation unlike any seen before. The clash would not be between battleships lined up in grand formations, but between carriers that projected power over vast distances. For Japan, the operation represented a chance to extend their dominance and threaten Australia's lifeline. For the United States and its allies, it was a test of resilience, and whether they could halt Japanese momentum. The fleets gathered were not equal in size or experience, and every ship represented a gamble in this high-stakes contest. Japanese naval forces included some of the most experienced carrier crews in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Indian Ocean raids. The American fleet, though smaller and still recovering from losses, had learned lessons from hard defeats. Each side prepared to pit technology, training, and doctrine against the other across the open waters. Every vessel carried within it not only steel and firepower, but the hopes of nations at war. The Coral Sea would become the first true carrier versus carrier battle in history. On the Japanese side, the backbone of their strike force rested on two fleet carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku. These modern vessels were fast, heavily armed, and capable of carrying nearly 80 aircraft each. Their decks bristled with Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, HED-3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Shōkaku and Zuikaku had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, honing the crews into battle-tested professionals. Supporting them were the light carrier Shōhu, designed for training but pressed into frontline duty. Though smaller and less powerful, Shōhu added crucial air cover for the invasion force aimed at Port Moresby. Accompanying the carriers were battleships, cruisers, and destroyers tasked with screening, anti-air defense, and bombardment. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive strikes, using carriers to cripple the enemy before surface ships closed in. Their strategy counted on speed, surprise, and overwhelming initial blows. Together, the Japanese fleet projected both confidence and lethal intent. In contrast, the US Navy entered the Coral Sea with carriers that carried both promise and vulnerability. The heart of the American force lay in the carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. These ships were older than Shōkaku and Zuikaku, but had proven adaptable in combat. Each carried around 70 aircraft, with Grumman Fear 4F Wildcats for defense, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers for precision, and Douglas TBD Devastators for torpedo runs. The crews were less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, but they displayed growing skill and determination. Escorting the carriers were heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, forming protective screens against submarines and air attack. Fuel tankers and supply ships also played critical roles, allowing the U.S. fleet to operate at extended ranges. American naval doctrine, still evolving, relied more on defense and careful strikes rather than aggressive risk-taking. The challenge would be coordinating these elements into an effective fighting force. At Coral Sea, U.S. commanders would test whether preparation could match Japanese battle experience. Aircraft composition highlighted one of the starkest contrasts between the two navies. The Japanese Zero fighter was renowned for its agility, long range, and dominance in dogfights. It often outperformed the American Wildcat, which was slower and less maneuverable. However, the Wildcat was rugged, armed with heavier guns, and capable of withstanding damage that would cripple a Zero. Dive bombers formed the core offensive punch for both navies. The Japanese Vel was accurate in steep dives, while the American SBD Dauntless combined precision with durability. Torpedo bombers were more problematic. The Japanese Kate was versatile and effective, while the US Devastator was outdated and slow. Pilots knew that going into attack runs meant flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire and interceptors. Every sortie would be a gamble with life and death. In the Coral Sea, aircraft performance would shape the tempo of battle far more than the size of ships. Surface ships still mattered. Even in an age dominated by carriers, Japanese battleships, though not central to the operation, provided firepower and psychological reassurance. Heavy cruisers and destroyers offered flexible escort capabilities, shielding carriers from submarines and aircraft. CERT's Navy relied heavily on cruisers for anti-aircraft fire, recognizing the vulnerability of carriers without strong escorts. Destroyers, fast and agile, formed screens against torpedoes and submarines lurking in the Pacific depths. Submarine patrols added another invisible layer of danger, hunting supply convoys and shadowing carrier groups. Logistics ships, though rarely celebrated, were lifelines for fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Without them, fleets could not remain at sea long enough to fight decisive battles. Every ship type, from mighty carriers to humble oilers, contributed to the outcome. The Coral Sea demonstrated that modern naval warfare was as much about coordination as it was about firepower. Victory would depend on how well each fleet managed its complex mosaic of vessels. Technology also defined the naval balance in 1942. Japanese ships carried advanced optics and skilled gunnery crews, but lagged in radar technology. In contrast, the US Navy had begun to deploy radar, giving its ships an advantage in detection and early warning. This allowed American commanders to anticipate air raids and prepare defenses. Still, radar was primitive, prone to misinterpretation, and limited by operator experience. Communications equipment also played a crucial role, with secure radio channels enabling coordination across scattered forces. Japanese reliance on coded signals gave them cohesion, but left them vulnerable to Allied codebreakers. Anti-aircraft armament was another critical difference. US ships bristled with rapid-firing guns, while Japanese ships often emphasized offensive aircraft over defensive gunnery. Damage control practices further tilted the balance, with American crews trained to contain fires and flooding effectively. Japanese ships, by contrast, often lacked such training, making them more vulnerable once struck. These technical factors would weigh heavily in the clash to come. Crew experience created both strengths and weaknesses for the fleets. Japanese carrier pilots were among the most skilled in the world, with years of rigorous training and combat experience. Their precision in coordinated attacks was unmatched at this stage of the war. However, Japan faced difficulties in replacing losses, as training new pilots required years that wartime urgency could not allow. The United States, though less experienced, possessed a vast training infrastructure capable of producing pilots quickly. American aviators were learning hard lessons in combat and adapting tactics with remarkable speed. On ship decks, discipline and efficiency determined how quickly aircraft could be launched, armed, and recovered. Japanese deck crews were masters of rapid turnaround, a vital skill in carrier warfare. American crews, though slower, emphasized safety and damage control to preserve planes and pilots. This difference reflected broader philosophies. Japan prioritized offense, while the US leaned toward resilience. At Coral Sea, both approaches would be put to the test. In assembling their fleets for the Coral Sea, both Japan and the Allies brought unique strengths and glaring weaknesses. Japan's advantage lay in experienced pilots, agile aircraft, and aggressive doctrine, yet it was hampered by overconfidence, lack of radar, and fragile damage control systems. The US Navy brought fewer carriers but possessed radar, stronger logistics, and improving pilot training. Aircraft like the Dauntless would prove decisive despite the shortcomings of the Devastator. Cruisers and destroyers on both sides prepared for punishing work in escort and defense. Behind the fleets loomed the silent struggle of intelligence, where Allied codebreaking gave commanders a priceless edge. Every carrier, plane, and escort would play a role in shaping the battle's outcome. The Coral Sea would not be won by strength alone, but by how fleets exploited their advantages and endured their weaknesses. The stage was now fully set for the first carrier battle in history. By late April 1942, Japan's plan to extend its control into the South Pacific had entered its execution phase. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled invasion forces designed to strike at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands and Port Moresby in New Guinea. Tulagi would serve as a forward base for seaplanes and reconnaissance, while Port Moresby was the ultimate prize that would bring Northern Australia under direct threat. Convoys loaded with troops, supplies, and equipment left their staging areas in Rabaul and Truk Lagoon. The Japanese High Command believed the Allies were still too weakened to mount serious resistance. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers escorted the transports to shield them from submarine and air attack. Above them, aircraft from carriers prepared to sweep away any opposition. The operation was carefully timed, intended to deliver a sudden blow before Allied intelligence could react. Yet, even as the Japanese advanced, unseen eyes were tracking their movements. The opening moves of the Coral Sea campaign had begun. The invasion force bound for Port Moresby was substantial, reflecting Japan's determination to secure this critical base. Under the command of Admiral Shigeyoshi Midway, the convoy carried thousands of soldiers trained for amphibious landings. These troops expected light resistance, as Japanese intelligence underestimated Allied defenses. Warships flanked the convoy, creating a protective perimeter against submarines and aircraft. Supply ships laden with ammunition, food, and fuel were essential to sustain the landing once secured. The Japanese had already demonstrated their mastery of amphibious operations in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Confidence ran high that Port Moresby would fall swiftly, opening the door to further operations against Australia. The soldiers on board were filled with anticipation, many believing they were participating in an unstoppable advance. Their morale was buoyed by recent victories across the Pacific and Asia. Few realized they were sailing into one of the decisive naval confrontations of the war. At the same time, a smaller Japanese detachment targeted Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Tulagi's sheltered harbor made it ideal for establishing a seaplane base, which could provide reconnaissance and extend Japan's air coverage. On May 3rd, Japanese troops landed unopposed, as Allied forces had already withdrawn. The rapid occupation of Tulagi gave the Japanese an early sense of triumph. Seaplanes began arriving almost immediately, signaling Japan's ability to expand its surveillance network. However, the victory was short-lived, as U.S. carrier aircraft struck back within hours. Dive bombers from the U.S. Yorktown descended on Tulagi's anchorage, sinking several Japanese support vessels. The attack shocked Japanese commanders, revealing that American carriers were operating much closer than anticipated. Though Tulagi remained in Japanese hands, the cost foreshadowed the challenges ahead. The Allies had made clear they would not allow unchecked expansion in the South Pacific. Allied preparations for the Japanese advance had been underway for weeks, guided by intelligence breakthroughs at Pearl Harbor's Station HYPO. Codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications that revealed plans for operations against Port Moresby. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders saw an opportunity to ambush the invasion force. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was ordered to lead Task Force 17, including carriers Yorktown and Lexington. Additional cruisers and destroyers joined to form a powerful escort, capable of both defense and offense. Australian and New Zealand forces prepared their own defenses in New Guinea, readying for the possibility of Japanese landings. Land-based aircraft from northern Australia also stood by to strike Japanese convoys. The Allies did not intend to cede Port Moresby without a fight. This convergence of intelligence, determination, and naval strength set the stage for the looming clash. For the first time, the Allies were prepared to confront Japan at sea on near equal terms. The Japanese invasion plan relied heavily on carrier air support to shield the convoys. Shōkaku and Zuikaku carried strike groups capable of launching devastating attacks against any Allied fleet that approached. Shōho, the smaller carrier, was assigned to provide direct cover for the invasion convoy. In theory, this layered defense would guarantee the safe passage of transports to Port Moresby. However, this reliance on carriers also created vulnerabilities. If the carriers were destroyed or neutralized, the transports would be left dangerously exposed. The Japanese command underestimated the growing competence of the U.S. Navy and its ability to coordinate long-range strikes. They also did not anticipate that their codes had been compromised. While their fleets moved with confidence, unseen risks gathered around them. The Coral Sea was about to reveal the changing balance of naval warfare. As Japanese forces advanced, the geography of the region played a decisive role in shaping strategy. The Coral Sea stretched vast and open, with scattered islands providing only limited anchorages. Supply lines were long and vulnerable to attack. Port Moresby, nestled on the southern coast of New Guinea, was protected by rugged terrain that complicated landings. Tulagi, though less significant, offered Japan a forward outpost that extended its operational reach. Control of these points would dictate who held dominance over sea lanes leading toward Australia. The Allies recognized that losing Port Moresby could isolate northern Australia from reinforcement. For Japan, seizing it would not only threaten Australia, but also secure their defensive perimeter. Every mile of ocean and every island outpost carried immense strategic weight. Geography, as much as firepower, would determine the outcome of the Coral Sea campaign. On board Allied ships, sailors and aviators prepared for battle with a mix of apprehension and determination. Many were aware that this confrontation would be unlike any other, with fleets striking at each other through aircraft rather than direct gunfire. Pilots studied maps, rehearsed tactics, and readied their planes for long-range missions over open water. Deck crews armed bombs and torpedoes, knowing the survival of their fleet depended on accuracy and timing. On the carriers, Fletcher and his commanders reviewed intelligence reports, weighing the risks of engaging superior Japanese forces. The morale of American and Australian sailors was boosted by the knowledge that they were defending Australia directly. Across the ocean, Japanese crews were equally resolute, confident their carriers would once again deliver victory. Both sides understood the stakes. Whoever controlled the Coral Sea would shape the Pacific War's trajectory. The men braced for a clash that would test skill, courage, and endurance. The opening moves were finished, and the collision was now inevitable. By the first days of May 1942, the invasion convoys and the Allied fleet were converging. Japanese troops were already ashore at Tulagi, building defenses and anchoring their presence in the Solomon Islands. Meanwhile, the Port Moresby invasion convoy steamed southward, screened by warships and awaiting carrier support. Fletcher maneuvered his carriers cautiously, seeking to preserve the element of surprise. Reconnaissance aircraft from both sides crisscrossed the skies, hunting for enemy fleets hidden in the expanse of ocean. Tension built as reports filtered in, some accurate, others misleading, adding to the fog of war. Every commander knew that discovery would lead swiftly to attack. For Japan, the success of the campaign hinged on overwhelming the Allied response. For the Allies, halting the invasion was essential to the defense of Australia. The stage was fully set for the Battle of the Coral Sea to erupt. On May 3, 1942, Japanese forces landed on Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, moving swiftly to establish a seaplane base. The small island's harbour was perfectly suited for reconnaissance operations that could extend Japanese surveillance deep into the Coral Sea. The landing force, consisting of several hundred naval troops, encountered no resistance as the island had already been evacuated by Australian defenders. For the Japanese, it seemed another easy victory in a string of rapid conquests across the Pacific. Construction crews immediately began preparing facilities to anchor seaplanes and support operations. The Japanese command believed Tulagi would strengthen their control and provide an essential stepping stone for their expansion southward. Yet this confidence concealed a vulnerability, for the U.S. Navy was already aware of their movements. Codebreakers had revealed Japanese intentions, allowing Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to move Task Force 17 into striking range. Fletcher knew that any chance to disrupt Japanese preparations must be seized. Tulagi would become the first target of American carrier strikes in the Coral Sea campaign. On the morning of May 4th, aircraft from the USS Yorktown roared into the skies, heading toward Tulagi. The carrier's strike group included dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, all primed to strike an unsuspecting enemy. Japanese troops on the island had grown complacent, confident that their operations were far beyond Allied reach. Suddenly, the drone of approaching engines shattered their illusions of security. Yorktown's dive bombers swept down on anchored Japanese ships in the harbour, dropping bombs with deadly precision. Several minesweepers, transports, and support vessels were struck and sent to the bottom. Torpedo planes followed, launching attacks on fleeing ships and strafing seaplanes on the water. Explosions and plumes of smoke rose above the harbour as chaos gripped the defenders. Within hours, the Japanese had suffered heavy losses in both men and material. The raid proved that American carriers could strike deep and without warning. The suddenness of the attack left Japanese commanders stunned. Their carefully laid plans to develop Tulagi into a reconnaissance hub were now in jeopardy. Without warning, the base they had secured just the previous day was turned into a burning wreck. Reports streamed back to Admiral Midway, revealing that the Americans had carriers operating nearby. This realization was deeply unsettling, for Japanese doctrine assumed that Allied carriers would avoid battle until forced. Now it was clear that U.S. naval aviation had gained the initiative. The loss of seaplanes crippled Japanese reconnaissance in the Solomon Islands, blinding their ability to track Allied movements. Soldiers on Tulagi, shocked by the ferocity of the American raid, scrambled to salvage equipment. Survivors dragged wounded comrades from the flaming wreckage of ships. The psychological impact was profound, as Japan's aura of invincibility in the Pacific began to erode. For the U.S. Navy, the raid on Tulagi carried symbolic and practical importance. Symbolically, it demonstrated that after Pearl Harbor, American carriers could take the fight directly to Japanese forces. Practically, it disrupted the establishment of a forward reconnaissance base that threatened Allied supply lines to Australia. Admiral Fletcher, cautious by nature, ordered a withdrawal after the strikes rather than risk his carrier in prolonged combat. Some critics later argued that Yorktown's strike could have pressed harder and caused even more destruction. Yet Fletcher understood the risks of lingering too long in enemy waters. He had achieved surprise, inflicted heavy losses, and forced the Japanese to reconsider their movements. The raid gave valuable combat experience to American pilots, many of whom had never engaged Japanese ships before. It also tested the coordination of dive bomber and torpedo squadrons in real battle conditions. In this way, Tulagi became both a tactical blow against Japan and a rehearsal for the greater clash to come. Despite the success of the raid, American pilots noted flaws in execution. Torpedo planes once again struggled with accuracy, a problem that would plague U.S. squadrons until later in the war. Several bombs missed their intended targets, highlighting the difficulty of precision attacks over water. Some aircraft were lost to Japanese anti-aircraft fire, a reminder that even lightly defended bases could inflict casualties. Pilots returned with mixed emotions, elation at striking the enemy, but sobered by the realization of how costly these engagements could become. Still, morale aboard Yorktown was high, as the crews celebrated their first decisive strike of the campaign. News of the raid spread quickly among Allied ranks, bolstering confidence in naval aviation. Fletcher reported back that his forces had disrupted Japanese plans and demonstrated striking power. For men who had endured months of Japanese advances, Tulagi was a much-needed reversal. The lesson was clear: American carriers could disrupt Japan's timetable and force them onto the defensive. This realization changed the psychology of the campaign. The Japanese reaction to the Tulagi raid was one of urgency and recalibration. Commanders quickly realized that the Americans must be intercepted before they could strike again. Carrier groups Shōkaku and Zuikaku, operating nearby, were ordered to move south and hunt down the American task force. The invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby was now in potential jeopardy. What had been envisioned as a smooth advance into the Coral Sea had been disrupted by unexpected resistance. The raid exposed a critical weakness in Japanese planning, the assumption that U.S. carriers would remain reactive. In reality, codebreaking had given the Allies a decisive edge, allowing them to anticipate Japanese moves. Tulagi's losses also underscored the vulnerability of isolated garrisons without adequate air cover. Japanese soldiers left on the island dug in, awaiting further attacks that never came. The stage was set for a larger confrontation as both navies maneuvered for advantage. Strategically, Tulagi highlighted the evolving nature of warfare in the Pacific. No longer could ground forces rely solely on ships and garrisons to secure forward bases. Air power now dictated survival, and whoever controlled the skies controlled the campaign. The destruction of Japanese seaplanes limited their ability to track Allied fleets, blinding them at a crucial moment. For the Americans, Tulagi proved that even small-scale raids could alter the balance of power. It demonstrated the reach of carrier-based aviation and foreshadowed the larger carrier duels about to unfold. The battle also served as an intelligence windfall, confirming Japanese movements and priorities. Allied commanders recognized that every successful strike delayed Japan's timetable and bought time for reinforcements. Tulagi was more than a skirmish, it was the opening act of a drama that would culminate in the Coral Sea. History would remember it as the spark that ignited the first carrier clash of the war. In retrospect, the Battle of Tulagi was small compared to what followed, but its significance was immense. It revealed to both sides that the Coral Sea would not be an uncontested Japanese victory. For the Allies, it boosted morale and proved the effectiveness of carrier strikes. For the Japanese, it was a sobering reminder that their enemies were adaptive and resourceful. The losses in ships and aircraft, while not decisive, forced the Japanese to alter their operations. Tulagi became a symbol of shifting momentum in the Pacific War. The island would remain under Japanese control for months, but its usefulness as a seaplane base was compromised. More importantly, the encounter brought the opposing carrier groups within striking distance of each other. The prelude was over, and the curtain was about to rise on the main battle. The Coral Sea awaited its decisive moment, shaped by the lessons learned at Tulagi. The Battle of the Coral Sea was as much a contest of reconnaissance as it was of gunnery or aviation. Vast stretches of ocean separated the opposing fleets, making the task of finding the enemy both urgent and uncertain. Carriers like floating fortresses relied on their aircraft not only to strike, but also to scout the horizon. Every dawn saw waves of patrol planes launched into the empty sky, fanning out in search of the enemy. Pilots flew long, monotonous missions over endless blue waters, straining their eyes for the faintest shadow of a mast or the wake of a ship. Fuel limitations meant that each sortie carried risk, as planes could be lost if they extended too far without finding their carrier again. The Japanese and Americans alike knew that the side that spotted the other first would hold the decisive advantage. Reconnaissance became a deadly gamble of patience, timing, and navigation. Clouds, storms, and the curvature of the earth concealed movements, frustrating even the most skilled observers. In this vast arena, intelligence could tip the scales before a single bomb was dropped. For the Japanese, reconnaissance was deeply tied to their doctrine of offensive surprise. Admiral Takagi's carrier force launched scouting planes daily, sending them across wide arcs to locate Fletcher's task force. Yet their system had weaknesses, for overconfidence led to assumptions about where the enemy would appear. Sometimes aircraft were dispatched too late, or their search patterns overlapped inefficiently, leaving gaps in coverage. The Japanese seaplane bases established in Rabaul and Tulagi provided additional scouts, but many were destroyed or grounded after earlier American strikes. Commanders relied heavily on carrier-based scouts, risking valuable planes that could otherwise serve in combat roles. The vastness of the Coral Sea stretched their resources thin, forcing them to choose between covering too broad an area or leaving sectors vulnerable. Each missed sighting could mean disaster, for a hidden American carrier was a lurking predator. Miscommunication between aircrews and fleet headquarters further complicated the search. The struggle to find Fletcher's force illustrated the fragility of Japanese reconnaissance in practice. The Americans, under Admiral Fletcher, approached scouting with a mixture of caution and ingenuity. Task Force 17 operated with the USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, launching continuous patrols in multiple directions. Fletcher relied heavily on PBY Catalina flying boats, long-range patrol aircraft that could remain airborne for over 12 hours. These lumbering planes scoured the seas, sometimes enduring attacks by Japanese fighters as they pressed their search. Commanders had learned from Pearl Harbor that failing to detect enemy carriers early could prove fatal. Each day, pilots scribbled coordinates, reported cloud cover, and relayed sightings of minor enemy groups. Sometimes fishing boats, transports, or even shadows on the water were mistaken for warships, leading to tense moments of misjudgment. The challenge was not only in seeing the enemy, but also in interpreting incomplete data. Fletcher's intelligence officers pieced together fragments of reports, building a mosaic of Japanese intentions. This painstaking process highlighted how naval battles had become contests of information as much as firepower. Weather played a crucial role in the search for fleets. The Coral Sea was notorious for sudden squalls, shifting cloud cover, and tropical storms that cloaked movements. Carriers often used these weather systems as shields, hiding beneath cloud banks or maneuvering through rain squalls to avoid detection. Japanese aircraft sometimes returned with nothing, having seen only endless horizons of water broken by storms. American scouts too were thwarted by low visibility, forced to guess at enemy positions that slipped through their search arcs. At times, entire carrier groups passed within a few hundred miles of each other, each oblivious to the other's presence. This invisibility made the ocean feel like an enormous chessboard where pieces could vanish behind fog. Pilots flying alone over dangerous waters often experienced exhaustion and disorientation. Many wondered whether their reports would change the fate of fleets waiting far below. Weather, chance, and human endurance combined to shape the search in unpredictable ways. The Japanese sought to compensate for these difficulties with their famed doctrine of aggressive scouting. Long-range floatplanes were launched from cruisers and battleships, expanding the search grid. These aircraft, though slower than carrier scouts, could cover areas otherwise unreachable. However, recovering them was slow, leaving their motherships vulnerable during operations. The Japanese often underestimated the time required for reconnaissance, leading to gaps in intelligence. Miscalculations in sighting reports sometimes caused carriers to launch strikes against false targets. When sightings were delayed or unclear, the entire fleet's offensive rhythm faltered. Admirals aboard Shōkaku and Zukaku demanded precise information, but often received conflicting messages. Even when enemy forces were spotted, the lag in communication could cause opportunities to slip away. These flaws underscored the Japanese reliance on timing and coordination that was difficult to maintain in the chaotic expanse of the Pacific. For the Americans, reconnaissance success often came from persistence rather than precision. PBY Catalinas flew dangerous night patrols, extending the reach of Fletcher's intelligence network. In one critical instance, a Catalina spotted a Japanese invasion convoy moving toward Port Moresby, confirming the enemy's intentions. These reports gave Fletcher confidence that his carriers were positioned in the right sector to intercept. The price of such vigilance was high, for Catalinas were slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters. Crews often flew missions at extreme fatigue, surviving on courage and navigational skill. Many pilots described the terrifying emptiness of the ocean, knowing that a single engine failure meant certain death, yet their sacrifices ensured that Fletcher's task force avoided ambush and struck with foreknowledge. Unlike the Japanese, American reconnaissance was less rigid and more adaptive. This flexibility became a critical advantage as the fleets edged closer to battle. The tension of the search for fleets lay in its invisible drama. Sailors aboard carriers lived in suspense, knowing their fate depended on scouts far beyond the horizon. Each coded radio message could bring relief or terror, depending on whether enemy carriers had been sighted. Pilots understood the weight of their role, for a single accurate report could determine the outcome of the battle. Mistakes such as misidentifying a cruiser for a carrier could send fleets charging after ghosts. Radio silence added to the uncertainty, as scouts often withheld transmissions until their return. Commanders plotted enemy positions on charts, moving markers with nervous anticipation. Hours stretched into agonizing waits, as carriers maneuvered in empty seas. This psychological strain reminded crews that modern war was as much about information as firepower. The unseen hunt made the Coral Sea battle one of nerves as well as machines. By early May 1942, both fleets edged closer, circling unseen, like predators in the deep. The Japanese sought to shield their invasion convoy, while their carriers hunted the Americans. The U.S. forces sought to protect Port Moresby and strike at Japan's advancing fleet. Neither side fully grasped the other's position, leading to feints, false alarms, and near misses. Every day scouts launched, and every evening fleets adjusted their courses in response to incomplete intelligence. The tension built as the ocean seemed to tighten its grip around both armadas. Soon, luck and persistence would reveal the hiding places of carriers on both sides. The first carrier clash in history depended not merely on bold admirals, but on tired pilots peering down at endless waves. In the Coral Sea, information was the weapon that unlocked the ability to strike. The search was nearly over, and the battle was about to begin. The morning of May 7, 1942, dawned with both sides still searching for each other in the vast Coral Sea. The Japanese fleet under Vice Admiral Tulagi believed they had located the main American carriers to the south. In reality, their reconnaissance planes had misidentified a small oiler and destroyer group. Admiral Fletcher, by contrast, had received reports of a Japanese covering force near Mishima Island. Acting decisively, Fletcher launched waves of aircraft from the Yorktown and Lexington. Pilots scrambled to their planes, engines roaring as deck crews armed bombs and torpedoes with feverish precision. The mission was risky, for the American carriers were still uncertain of the full Japanese disposition. Yet intelligence suggested a vulnerable target lay ahead, and Fletcher seized the opportunity. As the planes climbed into the sky, sailors on deck watched silently, knowing their comrades carried the hopes of the fleet. What unfolded next would mark the first dramatic clash of carrier warfare in history. The American strike force consisted of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and escorting fighters, coordinated for a concentrated assault. Navigation over the open sea was difficult, but the pilots pressed forward, guided by scattered clouds and faint island landmarks. Soon their target emerged, the Japanese light carrier Shōkaku, part of the covering force for the Port Moresby invasion convoy. Shōkaku was a smaller vessel, less armored than fleet carriers, and therefore highly vulnerable to air attack. She carried a limited air group of roughly 18 aircraft, insufficient to provide a strong defensive screen. Japanese escort cruisers and destroyers braced themselves as enemy planes appeared overhead. Anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, filling the skies with black puffs of flak. Yet the sheer volume of American aircraft overwhelmed Shōkaku's defenses. The carrier suddenly found herself the prey of a determined and skillfully executed strike. The first great test of American carrier aviation had arrived. The dive bombers from Yorktown struck first, their dauntless aircraft screaming down from high altitude. Pilots aimed for Shōkaku's flight deck, releasing bombs that streaked toward the small carrier. Explosions tore across the deck, igniting fires and sending debris raining into the sea. Following close behind, torpedo bombers pressed home their attack, maneuvering through withering fire. Several torpedoes struck Shōkaku along her port side, ripping open her hull below the waterline. The combination of bombs and torpedoes crippled the carrier almost instantly. Flames engulfed the hangar deck, where fuel and munitions turned the ship into a furnace. Crewmen struggled desperately to contain the inferno, but their efforts were hopeless. Smoke billowed into the sky, marking the carrier's death throes. In less than 15 minutes, Shōkaku was fatally wounded. From above, American pilots witnessed the destruction with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. The carrier that had been their target moments earlier now burned furiously, her decks twisted and collapsing. Japanese sailors leapt into the water, some engulfed in flames, others clinging desperately to debris. Escort ships maneuvered frantically to rescue survivors, even as bombs continued to rain down. Pilots reported direct hits with astonishing clarity, communicating over radios in clipped, excited tones. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading the Lexington's dive bombers, sent back the famous message, "Scratch one flat op." The words electrified American forces, carried across the airwaves as a symbol of hope. On the decks of Yorktown and Lexington, cheers erupted when the message was received. For a navy still recovering from Pearl Harbor, this victory was a cathartic moment. The psychological impact was as powerful as the tactical result. The loss of Shōkaku sent shockwaves through the Japanese command. She was the first carrier of the Imperial Japanese Navy to be sunk in the war. More than 600 of her crew perished in the attack, a staggering blow to morale. For Tulagi and his subordinates, the sinking underscored the vulnerability of carriers when caught without adequate air cover. The Japanese invasion convoy, meant to secure Port Moresby, suddenly lacked essential aerial protection. Escorting warships could not hope to provide the same offensive and defensive power as a carrier. The Americans had demonstrated that striking carriers first was the key to naval victory. This realization forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their deployment. Yet the loss of Shōkaku was only the beginning of a much larger contest. The real confrontation between the main carrier forces still lay ahead. For the Americans, the sinking of Shōkaku validated their faith in carrier aviation. The attack had been meticulously coordinated, showing that dive bombers and torpedo planes could combine to devastating effect. Lessons learned from months of training and exercises now bore fruit in combat. Pilots gained confidence, knowing they had successfully executed the world's first coordinated carrier strike. Sailors aboard the carriers celebrated, but they also prepared for retaliation, knowing the Japanese main fleet remained at large. Admiral Fletcher understood that Shōkaku was only a secondary target, and that larger carriers were still hunting him. The battle was far from over, and every man in the task force felt the tension. Nonetheless, morale soared, for the United States Navy had finally struck back decisively. News of the sinking spread quickly, lifting spirits across the Pacific theater. Pearl Harbor's humiliation had begun to be avenged. Survivors of Shōkaku told grim stories of chaos and horror. As flames spread uncontrollably, compartments filled with smoke, suffocating trapped crewmen, explosions from ignited fuel tanks shook the ship violently, throwing sailors off their feet. Rescue efforts were hindered by the speed of the destruction, leaving many with no chance of escape. Some clung to wreckage in shark-infested waters, praying for escort ships to reach them in time. Others described the suddenness of the attack, the terrifying descent of bombs, and the deafening roar of torpedoes. For the Japanese Navy, the sinking was a devastating reminder of the risks of underestimating the enemy. Families of the lost sailors would never know the full extent of their suffering. Shōkaku's demise joined the long list of tragedies that marked the Pacific War. Yet her sinking became a turning point in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The phrase "scratch one flat op" entered naval history as a rallying cry. It encapsulated the moment when the US Navy proved it could meet Japan on equal terms. Though Shōkaku was a light carrier, her destruction showed that Japanese naval dominance was not invincible. The psychological effect on both sides was enormous, raising American confidence while shaking Japanese assumptions. The attack demonstrated the decisive role of air power, where planes, not battleships, determined the outcome. For historians, May 7th marked the dawn of true carrier warfare. No longer would surface ships dictate battles. Instead, the skies had become the ultimate battlefield. Fletcher's gamble, supported by intelligence and daring pilots, had paid off. Yet, as the smoke cleared, both fleets knew the real clash was still to come. The Battle of the Coral Sea had only just begun to reveal its ferocity. As Shōnha slipped beneath the waves, Japanese commanders sought immediate retaliation. Admiral Tulagi ordered carrier-based aircraft to locate and strike what they believed to be the main American force. Reconnaissance pilots, flying over the vast expanse of the Coral Sea, faced the same difficulties as their American counterparts. Misidentification became a dangerous flaw in the fog of war, leading to fateful mistakes. Japanese spotters reported sighting a carrier group near the Louisiade archipelago. In truth, the carriers they identified were actually the oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims. Believing the intelligence to be accurate, Japanese commanders launched a major strike force of torpedo bombers and dive bombers. For the aircrews, this was a chance to avenge the loss of Shōnha. Yet, unbeknownst to them, they were flying towards secondary targets, not the prized American carriers. The miscalculation would shape the course of the day. The Japanese strike group flew southward, scanning the horizon for enemy decks. Hours passed as the aircraft searched, consuming precious fuel with every mile. Finally, they spotted the Neosho and Sims, mistaking the small vessels for part of an American carrier task force. Excitement filled the cockpits as pilots prepared for the attack. Dive bombers peeled off from altitude, releasing their payloads on the unassuming destroyer. Explosions ripped through the Sims, breaking her in half and sending her to the bottom. The oiler Neosho, though larger, was also defenseless against the onslaught. Multiple bombs struck her decks, igniting fuel stores and spreading infernos throughout the ship. Sailors scrambled for survival as their vessel burned furiously. The Japanese believed they had scored a decisive victory. For the crew of the Sims, the attack was catastrophic and swift. Anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly, but the sheer number of enemy planes overwhelmed their defenses. Direct hits shattered the destroyer's hull, leaving no chance for repair or escape. Within minutes, the ship was engulfed in smoke and flames. Survivors leapt into the sea, clinging to debris as the vessel sank beneath the waves. For many, there was little time to process the horror unfolding around them. The Japanese pilots circled overhead, convinced they had destroyed an American carrier escort. In truth, the loss of Sims was tragic, but strategically minor. Yet for the sailors who went down with their ship, it was the end of everything. Their sacrifice became one of the untold stories of Coral Sea. The Neosho, meanwhile, struggled desperately to remain afloat. Fires raged across her decks as sailors fought to contain the damage. Bombs had ruptured her fuel tanks, spilling thousands of gallons of oil into the sea. The slick ignited, surrounding the oiler in a floating ring of fire. Men worked with hoses, pumps, and sheer determination to save their stricken vessel. Despite their bravery, the Neosho was mortally wounded. She drifted helplessly, her crew clinging to hope that rescue would come. Japanese pilots, seeing the devastation, radioed back exaggerated reports. They claimed to have crippled an American carrier and sunk one of its escorts. In Tokyo, and aboard Japanese flagships, this was hailed as a victory. This misidentification created a dangerous illusion for Japanese commanders. Believing they had destroyed or disabled American carriers, they grew overconfident. Admiral Tulagi reported to Yamamoto that the US fleet was in retreat. The truth was far different. Yorktown and Lexington remained untouched, their aircraft preparing for the next engagement. This gap in perception was critical, shaping Japanese planning for the following day. Instead of pressing more aggressively, they assumed their objective was nearly complete. The loss of Shanshaw was thus partially overshadowed by supposed success against American carriers. Intelligence failures had handed the Americans a reprieve. In carrier warfare, misinformation could be as lethal as bombs. The stage was now set for a far bloodier confrontation. For American sailors, the destruction of Sims and crippling of Neosho was a bitter reminder of war's unpredictability. Fletcher had deliberately positioned the oiler away from the main fleet to reduce risk. Ironically, that decision placed her directly in the path of Japanese aircraft. The men aboard fought courageously, some rescuing shipmates from flames, while others manned guns until the last moment. Survivors recalled the smell of burning oil and the roar of dive bombers diving at impossible angles. Their resistance delayed the inevitable, but demonstrated remarkable discipline under fire. Rescue operations were nearly impossible in the chaos of ongoing naval battles. Many sailors floated for hours, exposed to sun, thirst, and fear of sharks. The tragedy underscored the vulnerability of support ships in carrier warfare. Every vessel, no matter how humble, bore the weight of the conflict. On the Japanese side, pilots returned to their carriers believing they had struck a decisive blow. Reports of a crippled carrier boosted morale, easing the sting of Shōkaku's loss. Aircrews were congratulated, their commanders convinced that the Americans were now on the defensive. Yet doubts lingered among some officers who questioned the scale of the destruction. Reconnaissance had been limited, and enemy carriers had yet to be positively identified. Still, the narrative of success spread quickly across the fleet. Yamamoto himself was informed that the operation was progressing favorably. This confidence influenced the decision to press forward with the Port Moresby invasion plan. In reality, the American carriers were intact and preparing to strike again. The fog of war had created a dangerous deception. The counterattacks of May 7th showed the peril of misjudgment in naval warfare. The Japanese had inflicted genuine losses, but miscalculated their significance. Believing they had crippled the main American fleet, they underestimated the danger still lurking. Fletcher, meanwhile, recognized the importance of protecting his carriers for the decisive clash. He withdrew slightly, keeping Yorktown and Lexington positioned for the next day's engagement. The stage was now set for the first true carrier versus carrier battle in history. Misidentification, faulty intelligence, and the chaos of war had written the day's script. Both sides ended May 7th, claiming some measure of victory, but only one side truly understood the precarious balance that remained. The real test would come on May 8th, in the skies above the Coral Sea. The morning of May 8, 1942, dawned with both fleets aware that the decisive clash was at hand. Japanese carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku, though diminished by the loss of Shōkaku, remained formidable. Facing them were the American carriers Lexington and Yorktown, whose survival was crucial to halting Japan's southern advance. Both sides launched scouting aircraft at first light, desperate to find the other before being found themselves. The vastness of the Coral Sea meant that timing and luck would determine the battle's course. Pilots scoured the horizon, reporting back partial sightings, cloud-obscured ships, and uncertain bearings. By mid-morning, contact reports clarified positions. The Japanese had located the Americans, and the Americans had located the Japanese. The battle would unfold almost simultaneously, with strike groups en route in both directions. Each fleet, blind to the progress of the other's attack, braced for impact. The stage was set for the first full-scale carrier versus carrier battle in naval history. From Yorktown and Lexington, American strike groups roared into the sky. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and escorting fighters formed tight formations as they sped toward Shōkaku and Zuikaku. Many pilots carried the weight of knowing that their attack could decide the campaign's fate. Japanese carriers, meanwhile, were also launching their strike groups against the Americans. The skies became a crisscross of converging aircraft, like arrows fired from opposing bows. Each side gambled that its offensive power could cripple the enemy before its own carriers were struck. The tension among commanders was immense as radio reports tracked enemy positions. Fletcher and his staff monitored every transmission, aware that seconds could spell disaster or salvation. Japanese commanders, equally tense, counted on their pilots' training and precision. As the squadrons closed in, both sides prepared for a storm of steel and fire. The American strike force was the first to reach its target, sighting Shōkaku in the late morning. The carrier steamed below, flanked by escorts and weaving evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft guns erupted, filling the sky with black flak bursts. Dive bombers from Yorktown began their screaming descents, braving deadly fire to release their bombs. Explosions tore across Shōkaku's flight deck, ripping open her surface and setting fires below. Flames engulfed aircraft being refueled and armed, creating secondary explosions. The carrier staggered, her deck a ruined mess that made further flight operations nearly impossible. Torpedo planes added to the assault, though most were driven off by Japanese fighters. Still, Shōkaku reeled from the punishment, her crew struggling to keep her afloat. Though not sunk, she was effectively knocked out of the battle. Shōkaku, the other Japanese carrier, avoided direct hits but faced constant pressure. Thick cloud cover shielded her from accurate bombing runs, frustrating American pilots. Torpedo bombers aimed their deadly weapons, but evasive maneuvers spared the ship. Even so, Shōkaku was forced to launch and recover aircraft under chaotic conditions. American attacks claimed several Japanese planes as they attempted to defend their carrier. Damage may have been limited, but Shōkaku's operational tempo was slowed. Her ability to mount coordinated strikes was hindered by disrupted flight operations. Pilots who returned found their decks slick with fuel and littered with wreckage. The Japanese task force had absorbed a blow that shifted momentum toward the Americans. For Fletcher's carriers, however, the reprieve was short-lived. Even as Shōkaku burned and Shōkaku faltered, Japanese strike groups were already bearing down on the Americans. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes surged toward Lexington and Yorktown with ruthless precision. American combat air patrols rose to meet them, engaging in desperate dogfights over the fleet. Yet the sheer number of incoming attackers meant many still broke through. Yorktown was the first to come under coordinated attack. Bombs fell around her, one striking the flight deck and causing significant structural damage. Flames and smoke erupted, but damage control teams quickly contained the fires. Torpedoes streaked toward Lexington, slamming into her hull and rocking the massive ship. The Lady Lex, as she was known, shuddered from the impact but remained afloat. For the sailors below deck, the fight for survival had just begun. The battle around Lexington grew increasingly desperate as explosions multiplied. Fires spread through her compartments, ignited by ruptured fuel lines and detonating munitions. Crewmen fought back with hoses, sand, and sheer determination, struggling to contain the inferno. Above, gunners blazed away at incoming planes, some falling in burning spirals into the sea. Despite damage, Lexington's pilots continued launching sorties, a testament to their discipline. Yorktown also bore scars from bomb impacts but retained operational capacity. Her flight deck, though scarred, continued to send aircraft aloft to defend the fleet. Every man aboard both carriers knew the outcome of this clash would define the Pacific War. Japanese pilots pressed their attacks, convinced they could finish the job. Yet the American carriers refused to yield. As the smoke cleared, both sides tallied their losses. Shōkaku was crippled, Zuikaku bloodied, but neither had been sunk outright. Lexington, though afloat, was fatally wounded from internal explosions and fires. Her crew performed heroic damage control, but secondary blasts sealed her fate. Yorktown, battered but still fighting, remained the lone American carrier able to continue. Japanese air groups, depleted from heavy losses, returned with far fewer aircraft than they had launched. The sky over the Coral Sea was littered with burning wrecks of planes from both nations. Each side had dealt and received punishing blows in equal measure. For the first time in history, carriers had clashed directly without surface ships firing a shot. The future of naval warfare had been irrevocably rewritten. By nightfall on May 8th, the Battle of the Coral Sea had reached its climax. Both fleets withdrew, too bloodied to continue pressing the fight. The Japanese had achieved some tactical gains, sinking Lexington, but their strategic objectives remained unfulfilled. Port Moresby, the ultimate prize, was left beyond their grasp. The Americans, though battered, had inflicted crippling losses on the enemy's carrier force. Shōkaku would require extensive repairs, and Zuikaku's depleted air group made her combat ineffective. For Japan, this meant the Coral Sea was a strategic setback, despite tactical claims of victory. For the Allies, it was a critical step in halting Japanese momentum. The clash of giants had ended not with a decisive blow, but with a shift in strategic balance. The Pacific War would never be the same. The USS Lexington, affectionately known as the Lady Lex, stood as a proud symbol of American naval power in the early Pacific War. Commissioned in 1927, she was one of the Navy's oldest but most formidable carriers, repurposed from a battlecruiser hull into a floating airbase. On May 8, 1942, she faced her sternest test during the climactic phase of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes, striking with precision and ferocity, delivered a deadly combination of blows against her. 2 torpedoes slammed into her starboard side, ripping open compartments and rupturing fuel lines. Almost simultaneously, bombs rained down from the skies, one detonating near the flight deck, shattering structural supports. At first, Lexington's crew believed the damage, while severe, might still be contained through determined effort. Damage control teams rushed below decks, sealing off flooded compartments and manning fire hoses. Smoke filled the air, yet the ship continued to operate, launching and recovering aircraft despite her wounds. The men clung to hope that their ship, their home at sea, could be saved. Within minutes, however, Lexington's condition began to worsen. Gasoline fumes from ruptured aviation fuel lines seeped into lower compartments, creating a volatile atmosphere. When sparks ignited these fumes, massive secondary explosions erupted, reverberating through the ship like thunder. Flames tore through corridors, consuming everything in their path, while smoke choked sailors struggling to breathe. Some compartments became instant death traps, sealed by fire and flooding. The roar of explosions was so constant that men described it as a drumbeat of destruction. Yet even amid chaos, damage control crews pressed forward, dragging hoses and extinguishers through smoke-filled decks. They fought the fires with sand, water, and sheer willpower, often collapsing from exhaustion. Every sailor knew their fight was not just for the ship, but for their comrades still trapped below. The battle for Lexington's survival had become a war within a war. Above deck, the scene was equally harrowing. Smoke billowed skyward in thick black plumes, visible for miles across the sea. Pilots returning from sorties landed on a deck scarred by craters, dodging wreckage and fire crews. Some aircraft, too damaged to be recovered safely, ditched into the sea, their crews rescued by waiting destroyers. Anti-aircraft gunners, still manning their stations, fired at straggling Japanese planes even as their own ship burned beneath them. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt water and scorched steel, creating a suffocating haze. Despite these conditions, flight operations continued briefly, a testament to the determination of the crew. Officers coordinated with calm precision, maintaining discipline even as chaos threatened to overwhelm order. Each order shouted across the decks was a lifeline holding the ship together. The Lexington was wounded, but her men refused to surrender her easily. She remained a fighting ship to the very end. By midday, Lexington's situation had grown critical. Additional explosions tore through her interior, knocking sailors off their feet and collapsing bulkheads. Fire spread uncontrollably, consuming ammunition stores and threatening the bridge itself. Medical teams worked tirelessly, treating burned and wounded sailors in makeshift triage stations amid the smoke. Some sailors carried injured comrades across fiery decks, their uniforms charred and faces blackened with soot. Others volunteered for near-suicidal missions into lower decks to secure vital machinery. Each act of courage was marked by the knowledge that time was running out. Officers debated whether the ship could remain afloat, but the scale of internal damage left little doubt. Ammunition magazines, dangerously close to ignition, posed the risk of catastrophic detonation. Lexington's men were fighting not just the Japanese, but the relentless fury of their own ship's destruction. Eventually, Admiral Fletcher and Captain Frederick Sherman made the grim decision to abandon ship. The order, carried over intercoms and shouted through corridors, struck sailors like a thunderclap of despair. For many, Lexington had been more than a ship. It had been their home, their shield, and their pride. Crewmen gathered at evacuation points, lowering lifeboats and scrambling across ladders to destroyers standing by. Some men jumped directly into the ocean, clinging to rafts or wreckage. Even in these final moments, sailors displayed remarkable discipline, helping one another into boats and ensuring the wounded were evacuated first. Lifeboats filled quickly, and destroyers maneuvered perilously close to pluck survivors from the water. The evacuation, carried out under fire and chaos, was a remarkable display of organization amid tragedy. By late afternoon, over 2,700 sailors had been rescued, a testament to the Navy's resolve to save its men. Lexington herself, however, was beyond saving. Once the crew had been evacuated, Lexington's fate rested in the hands of her escorts. Fires still raged unchecked, explosions continuing to ripple through her frame. She floated stubbornly, her silhouette shrouded in smoke, as though unwilling to surrender, but every passing minute made it clear that she was a ghost ship, too crippled to be towed or repaired. To prevent her from falling into enemy hands or exploding unpredictably, a final decision was made. The destroyer USS Phelps was ordered to scuttle the Lady Lex with torpedoes. As the crew watched from the decks of rescue ships, torpedoes streaked into Lexington's hull. One after another, explosions ripped into her already broken body. Slowly, with a groan that seemed to echo across the sea, the once mighty carrier slipped beneath the waves. The Lady Lex was gone, but her memory burned in the hearts of her men. The loss of Lexington was a crushing blow for the U.S. Navy. She was one of only a handful of carriers available at that stage of the Pacific War. Her destruction underscored the fragility of naval power in an age dominated by aircraft and long-range strikes. Yet her sacrifice had not been in vain. The damage inflicted on Japanese carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku ensured they could not press forward with the invasion of Port Moresby. Lexington's final stand symbolized the cost of holding the line in the Coral Sea. Survivors carried stories of courage and tragedy back to Pearl Harbor, their testimonies spreading through the fleet. For the men who lived, the image of their burning ship remained etched in memory forever. For the men who died aboard her, the Lady Lex became their eternal resting place. Her loss was mourned, but her sacrifice gave birth to hope. In the grand sweep of history, Lexington's sinking marked a turning point in naval warfare. It highlighted both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of aircraft carriers, the new capital ships of the age. Her destruction became a rallying cry for the Navy, fueling determination to avenge her loss. Newspapers back home honored her crew as heroes, praising their discipline and valor in the face of disaster. The phrase "scratch one flat top" became a symbol not just of Japanese losses, but of the cost paid by Americans. Lexington's fate reinforced the lesson that victory in the Pacific would demand terrible sacrifices. At the same time, it proved that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with Japan and blunt its offensive. The Coral Sea had not been a decisive triumph, but it was a strategic victory bought with Lexington's life. Her story became legend, retold in naval academies and history books for generations. The Lady Lex was gone, but her spirit endured in every carrier that followed. On May 8, 1942, as the Battle of the Coral Sea reached its climax, the Japanese carrier Shōkaku became the focus of relentless American dive bomber attacks. The carrier, already engaged in heavy operations, found itself caught in the crosshairs of squadrons launched from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown. American SBD Dauntless bombers, diving steeply through anti-aircraft fire, scored direct hits across Shōkaku's flight deck. Explosions ripped through her wooden planking, tearing massive holes and scattering wreckage across the deck. Fire quickly spread from the aviation fuel reserves, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Crew members rushed to contain the damage, but chaos ruled as fire hoses failed, and ammunition stores threatened to ignite. Aircraft lined up for launch were obliterated in the blasts, their fuel and ordnance contributing to the inferno. The once proud carrier, designed to be the spear of Japan's naval power, was suddenly crippled in the open sea. Her decks, warped and shattered, were rendered useless for further flight operations. Shōkaku's survival was now in question. Despite the damage, Shōkaku's captain and crew fought with determination to save their ship. Bulkheads were sealed, flooding was controlled, and engineers worked frantically to stabilize her power systems. Below decks, men toiled in suffocating smoke-filled compartments, risking asphyxiation to repair pumps and electrical wiring. Medical teams set up emergency stations, treating scores of sailors wounded by fire, shrapnel, and blast injuries. Some survivors described the scene as hell on steel, where every corridor echoed with screams and the groan of twisted metal. On the flight deck, the task of clearing debris seemed impossible, as flames continued to lick the broken planking. Ammunition crews dumped unexploded bombs and shells overboard to prevent catastrophic detonation. Despite their bravery, the carrier's air group could no longer operate from her wrecked deck. Her strike capability, the very reason for her existence, had been erased in a single morning. Though Shōkaku remained afloat, she was no longer a weapon of war. The crippled state of Shōkaku forced Japan into an operational crisis. With her deck destroyed and her hangars filled with smoke and fire damage, she could no longer serve as a launching platform for aircraft. Her sister carrier Shōkaku, though undamaged in structure, faced her own dilemma. Her air groups had been mauled by American fighters and bombers. Many of Shōkaku's pilots were lost in the day's battles, leaving her decks eerily empty. Together, these two setbacks effectively neutralized Japan's carrier striking force. Where once the Japanese Navy had held momentum and numbers, it now found itself unable to press forward with the planned invasion of Port Moresby. Admirals debated continuing the offensive, but the loss of operational carriers meant the plan had collapsed. Japan's strategy depended on swift, decisive strikes, not on battles fought with crippled air power. The Coral Sea had revealed the fragility of naval supremacy built on carriers. Shōkaku's wounds symbolized a turning tide. The damage to Shōkaku had immediate tactical consequences. Her aircraft, grounded by the devastation of her deck, had to be relocated to other bases or withdrawn altogether. Without her contribution, Japanese air cover became dangerously thin. Shōkaku, left to shoulder the burden, found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of maintaining air patrols. The loss of experienced pilots only worsened the crisis, leaving green replacements unable to match American skill. Admiral Tulagi, commanding the carrier force, realized the operation could not be sustained. To continue the fight risked annihilation of Japan's precious carrier fleet, a resource far harder to replace than surface ships. Orders were given to withdraw, a decision that signaled the end of Japan's Coral Sea ambitions. Port Moresby, once within their grasp, would remain in Allied hands. For the first time in the war, Japan had been forced to turn back. The retreat of the Japanese carriers was cloaked in solemn silence. Shōkaku, barely able to maneuver, limped away under escort from cruisers and destroyers. Her flight deck, once alive with motion and the roar of engines, now stood empty and charred. Survivors of her air group mourned their comrades, many lost in the desperate defense earlier that day. Shōkaku, though outwardly intact, felt hollow with the absence of her pilots and aircraft. The sight of two carriers withdrawing marked a psychological blow as much as a material one. Japanese sailors, accustomed to unbroken victories since Pearl Harbor, were shaken by the realization that defeat was possible. The Imperial Navy had suffered damage it could not conceal from its officers and men. Admiral Yamamoto, upon receiving reports, grasped immediately that Coral Sea was more than a setback, it was a warning. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. The loss of operational capacity from Shōkaku and Shōkaku reshaped Japanese planning for the months to come. Both carriers required extensive repairs and reconstitution of air groups before returning to battle. This absence meant they would be unavailable for Yamamoto's next great gamble, the attack on Midway. At Midway, the absence of these two carriers would prove decisive, reducing Japan's striking power at the critical moment. American intelligence, meanwhile, celebrated the results as a strategic victory. Though the US had lost Lexington, the damage to Shōkaku and depletion of Shōkaku gave them breathing space in the Pacific. Naval historians often describe Coral Sea as a draw, but strategically it favored the Allies. Japan could no longer project force southward toward Australia. The battle marked the first time Japanese expansion had been checked. It was the first true crack in the armor of the rising sun. For the sailors aboard Shōkaku, survival itself became a point of pride. Their efforts had kept the carrier afloat when she might otherwise have sunk beneath the waves. Damage control crews were hailed as heroes, their courage ensuring the ship's eventual return to port. Yet their success only underscored the failure of the larger mission. Port Moresby remained unconquered, and the Coral Sea had drained Japan's resources without delivering results. In strategic terms, Shōkaku's crippling represented the failure of Yamamoto's gamble in the South Pacific. The Japanese High Command recognized that their fleet, though still formidable, could no longer count on overwhelming superiority. The Allies had shown resilience, coordination, and the ability to absorb losses. Japanese officers debated whether overextension had doomed their chances of sustaining offensives. Each discussion circled back to the battered decks of Shōkaku, the carrier that symbolized their dashed ambitions. In the aftermath of Coral Sea, Shōkaku limped back to Japan for months of repairs. Her crew disembarked to the somber realization that their efforts had brought survival but not victory. Shōkaku, depleted of pilots, likewise returned to port, awaiting the slow rebuilding of her air groups. This withdrawal marked the end of Japanese momentum in the South Pacific. For the Allies, the sight of Japanese carriers retreating was proof that determination and intelligence could blunt even the fiercest foe. Coral Sea became the battle that saved Australia, halting the southward tide of Japanese conquest. Though not as famous as Midway, its consequences were profound, shaping the course of the Pacific War. The damage to Shōkaku and withdrawal of the carriers marked a historic first. Japan's advance had been stopped cold. In the vastness of the Coral Sea, the balance of power had begun to shift. From this moment forward, Japan would face a long grinding struggle against an enemy that refused to break. For those who fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the clash was not just about ships and strategies, but about survival in a brutal new form of naval warfare. American and Japanese sailors alike faced the terror of not seeing their enemy directly, fighting instead through the roar of engines and the scream of incoming bombs. On the decks of carriers like USS Yorktown and Shōkaku, men worked feverishly to launch and recover planes, every second punctuated by the possibility of sudden death. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits, knowing that many would never return, their fate sealed over the endless blue horizon. Below deck, sailors endured the suffocating heat of engine rooms, where even a single torpedo hit could turn their workplace into a tomb. Mess halls became places of hurried meals and nervous laughter, masking fear that no one dared openly admit. On both sides, letters home carried words of bravery, but between the lines lay the heavy weight of uncertainty. Sleep was scarce, often interrupted by alarms warning of incoming strikes. For many, the sound of anti-aircraft guns became the rhythm of existence. Life in the Coral Sea was lived minute to minute, under the shadow of destruction. Among American pilots, courage was often mixed with dread, as they launched into skies filled with danger. Torpedo plane crews knew the odds against them, as their slow aircraft were easy prey for Japanese fighters. Yet they flew anyway, driven by duty and the knowledge that their sacrifice might help others strike a decisive blow. Survivors later recalled the deafening roar of anti-aircraft fire and the sight of comrades bursting into flames mid-air. Dive bomber pilots described the dizzying plunge toward enemy carriers, the earth rushing upward as they lined up their targets. Inside those few seconds, training and instinct decided whether their bombs would miss or strike with devastating effect. Many never saw the results of their courage, lost in the chaos of explosions and machine gun fire. Those who returned landed on blood-stained decks, greeted by ground crews who quickly patched bullet holes and refueled planes for the next wave. Even in victory, pilots mourned the friends who did not make it back. For them, Coral Sea was not just a battle, but a crucible of loyalty, fear, and sacrifice. On the Japanese side, pilots of Shōkaku and Zuikaku also faced harrowing missions that pushed them to the limits of human endurance. These aviators had been trained to perfection, steeped in the Bushido code that glorified honor and sacrifice. During their sorties, many fought with extraordinary skill, weaving through defensive fire to launch torpedoes or bombs at American ships. Yet behind the mask of discipline, many privately feared the odds, knowing each sortie could be their last. Survivors later recounted the exhaustion of flying multiple missions in a single day, their bodies aching and their nerves frayed. Some described the horror of watching entire squadrons wiped out before their eyes, comrades consumed in fireballs across the ocean. For others, the guilt of surviving weighed heavily as they lived while their closest friends perished. The Japanese pilots, often viewed as unstoppable warriors, were in truth men battling fear and fatigue. Their courage was undeniable, but so too was their suffering. Coral Sea etched into them memories that would haunt long after the war ended. Below the flight decks, life for sailors presented its own version of terror. Firefighting crews rushed into infernos with little more than hoses and masks, often engulfed in smoke so thick they could not see their own hands. Engineers worked amid the deafening roar of engines, their skin slick with sweat, knowing that one torpedo could send scalding steam or fire into their compartments. Medical staff faced a ceaseless tide of burned, broken, and bleeding bodies, struggling to save men with limited supplies. The sound of stretcher bearers echoing through narrow passageways became part of the daily rhythm of war. For cooks, the challenge was feeding men amid constant battle, meals served hurriedly on mess trays that rattled with each distant explosion. Many sailors spoke of the fear of fire, describing how a single hit could trap entire crews below decks. Others remembered the eerie quiet between battles, when the ocean seemed almost too calm, hiding death just beyond the horizon. The stress left many men shaking uncontrollably after alarms were sounded, their bodies betraying what their minds fought to control. For sailors, Coral Sea was a battle fought not only with weapons, but with endurance against fear itself. Testimonies from survivors reveal the emotional cost of Coral Sea in deeply personal ways. One American pilot recalled writing his last letter to his wife before takeoff, sealing it with the thought that she might never read his words. A Japanese sailor described holding the hand of a dying comrade as flames consumed their compartment, promising to tell his family though he knew he never could. For many, camaraderie was the glue that held them together, friendships forged in fire stronger than steel. Men remembered the quiet talks on deck at night, staring at the stars and wondering if they would live to see another dawn. In moments of despair, small acts of kindness, sharing a cigarette, offering water to the wounded, became lifelines of humanity. The ocean itself seemed both enemy and ally, offering escape in the vastness but threatening to swallow survivors of sinking ships. Those pulled from oil-slicked waters carried the haunting smell of burning fuel for years afterward. Survivors often spoke of guilt, questioning why they lived while so many others perished. The battle left scars not only on bodies, but also on souls. Coral Sea became a memory they carried for life, etched deeper than any medal or recognition. The terror of being under aerial attack was a shared experience that united both sides in their humanity. Men described the sound of incoming bombs as a whistling scream that seemed to last forever before impact. The concussive blasts shook ships violently, tossing men to the deck and filling compartments with smoke and dust. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their hands blistered, sweat dripping into their eyes as they tried to track fast-moving targets. Pilots above watched the sea erupt with geysers of water and fire, knowing at any moment one of those explosions could end their lives. Survivors of torpedo hits remembered the deafening crack of steel, the rush of water flooding compartments, and the chaos of trying to escape. On both sides, fear was ever present, but training and camaraderie helped men act even when terror threatened to paralyze them. Many later admitted that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving despite it. For those who endured, the sound of bombs falling and ships shuddering remained seared into memory. Coral Sea was not only a test of weapons, but of the human heart under fire. In the aftermath of battle, survivors struggled with grief and exhaustion. American sailors on Lexington wept openly as they abandoned their burning ship, watching the Lady Lex sink beneath the waves. Japanese pilots mourned the loss of comrades, many of whom had trained with them since their earliest days in aviation schools. For both sides, the sea became a graveyard, swallowing ships and men without ceremony. Survivors described drifting on rafts, surrounded by wreckage and oil, uncertain if rescue would come. Some were picked up quickly, while others spent long hours exposed to sun, thirst, and the endless horizon. The exhaustion of days without sleep left men hollow-eyed, moving mechanically through their duties. When the battle ended, relief was tempered by grief, as victory or survival could not erase the faces of the dead. Many spoke of carrying those memories for decades, unable to forget the sound of voices that went silent forever. Coral Sea was won and lost in strategy, but its legacy lived in human memory. Ultimately, the Battle of the Coral Sea was more than a clash of fleets. It was a crucible of human endurance. For the sailors and pilots who lived it, the experience revealed both the depths of fear and the heights of courage. Americans and Japanese enemies locked in deadly combat shared the same exhaustion, grief, and desperate will to survive. The personal stories of sacrifice gave the battle a human dimension beyond statistics and strategy. Letters, diaries, and testimonies preserved voices that might otherwise have been lost in history's silence. Their words remind us that behind every carrier, every aircraft, and every decision stood men struggling against death. The Coral Sea tested not just navies, but the resilience of the human spirit. For those who fought, it was a memory that would never fade, etched into their lives as both pride and sorrow. For us today, their stories serve as a bridge, allowing us to feel the human heartbeat beneath the clash of machines. In the end, the Coral Sea belongs as much to the sailors and pilots as it does to history itself. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Coral Sea, both sides claimed victory, but the truth was far more complex. On the surface, Japan could point to the sinking of USS Lexington and the damage inflicted on Yorktown as clear tactical achievements. The Americans, however, had destroyed the Japanese light carrier Shōkaku and heavily damaged Shōkaku, leaving Zuikaku's air group depleted. Losses in ships and aircraft appeared roughly balanced, but the long-term consequences tipped the scales. For Japan, the battle was intended to pave the way for the invasion of Port Moresby, yet that objective was thwarted. The failure to seize Port Moresby meant that Australia remained safe from direct threat, preserving Allied lines of communication. Japan's tactical success therefore masked a deeper strategic setback. For the United States, the survival of Yorktown, even in damaged condition, proved decisive in the weeks ahead. When measured in terms of objectives, Coral Sea was the first time Japan's advance had been stopped. In that sense, the Allies achieved a crucial strategic victory. The Japanese had entered the Coral Sea campaign with ambitious goals, aiming to extend their defensive perimeter and isolate Australia. Their plan was bold, seeking to strike at Port Moresby while simultaneously occupying Tulagi. Yet the damage sustained in the battle forced Admiral Midway to cancel the invasion altogether. Without carrier air cover, the Japanese invasion fleet could not risk facing American surface and air power. This decision effectively marked the first major Japanese retreat of the war, even if it was not admitted at the time. Strategically, it was a psychological blow to Japan, which had known only victories since Pearl Harbor. The Allies, meanwhile, recognized the significance immediately, seeing that Japan's aura of invincibility had been shattered. The survival of Australia as a base of operations meant that future Allied offensives could be launched northward. Coral Sea therefore represented a turning point, even if its importance was overshadowed by Midway 1 month later. It set the stage for a shift in momentum in the Pacific War. From a tactical standpoint, The Japanese still held some advantages after Coral Sea. Their carrier fleet, though damaged, remained a formidable force, and their pilots had proven their skill once again. The Americans, by contrast, had lost Lexington, one of their few remaining fleet carriers. Yorktown's survival came at the cost of significant damage, requiring rapid repairs before the next major confrontation. At the time, Japanese leaders could confidently argue they had dealt heavier blows. Yet this analysis ignored the reality that Japan could not easily replace lost carriers or trained aircrews. The attritional cost of the battle hit Japan harder than it hit the United States. American shipyards and training programs could recover losses far faster than Japan's constrained resources allowed. Thus, while tactically impressive, Japan's achievements at Coral Sea were strategically hollow. The imbalance of replacement capacity meant that time was on the Allies' side. Port Moresby was the true prize of the campaign, and it was Japan's failure to secure it that defined the battle's outcome. Had Japan succeeded, the Allies would have faced immense challenges protecting Australia and its supply lines. From Port Moresby, Japanese aircraft could have struck deep into Allied-held territories, threatening vital sea routes. The prevention of this invasion ensured that Australia remained secure, bolstering morale across the Allied world. American newspapers celebrated Coral Sea as a defensive triumph, highlighting the bravery of sailors and airmen. For Australians, the battle had life-or-death implications, protecting their homeland from direct threat. Japan's inability to complete its mission meant the battle was strategically lost, regardless of sunk tonnage. Even Admiral Yamamoto acknowledged privately that the failure to secure Port Moresby was a blow. The survival of Allied bases in the region meant future offensives could be staged. Coral Sea thus safeguarded the southern Pacific from collapse. The Japanese Navy was also forced to reckon with the limits of its operational reach. Coral Sea highlighted the difficulty of coordinating vast fleets over immense distances. The Japanese divided their forces, attempting to cover multiple objectives at once, which weakened their overall effectiveness. Their reconnaissance efforts faltered, leaving them vulnerable to surprise attacks. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence breakthroughs gave the Americans a decisive edge in anticipating Japanese movements. These factors combined to nullify Japan's superior numbers and experience. The loss of Shōkaku and the crippling of Shōkaku meant that 2 carriers were unavailable for Midway weeks later. This reduction in strength would have enormous consequences as Japan entered the Midway battle without its full complement. Coral Sea therefore had a direct hand in shaping the outcome of the next great naval clash. What looked like a narrow tactical engagement rippled outward into a strategic turning point. The American public embraced Coral Sea as a sign that the tide of war might finally be turning. Newspapers hailed it as the battle that saved Australia, even if casualty lists painted a sobering picture. President Roosevelt emphasized the battle's significance, praising the courage of the Navy and reminding citizens that sacrifices were buying time and hope. For sailors and pilots who fought, the battle was remembered not in grand terms, but in the faces of comrades lost. Survivors spoke of Lexington sinking with both grief and pride, seeing it as a necessary price for victory. Japanese propaganda initially claimed success, boasting of American losses while downplaying their own setbacks. Yet within military circles, doubts grew about Japan's ability to sustain its offensive momentum. The loss of experienced pilots was particularly damaging, as replacements could not match their skill. For America, Coral Sea demonstrated that determination and intelligence could balance the odds. For Japan, it was the first reminder that its empire had limits. Historians have since debated the question of who truly won the Battle of the Coral Sea. Some emphasized the tactical Japanese success, pointing to the carrier losses and American casualties. Others stressed the strategic Allied victory, underlining the prevention of Port Moresby's capture. The most balanced assessment recognizes both truths, but acknowledges that strategy outweighs tactics in the long run. By halting Japan's advance, Coral Sea ensured that the Allies could regroup and counterattack in the Pacific. The battle also marked the first carrier versus carrier confrontation in history, setting a precedent for future naval warfare. In this sense, its lessons went beyond immediate outcomes, influencing tactics and doctrine for years to come. Coral Sea's significance therefore lies not only in who lost more ships, but in what the battle meant for the course of the war. It was a victory of endurance, information, and strategic positioning. It was also a warning to Japan that its dominance could be challenged. In the end, Coral Sea was a paradox, a battle Japan appeared to win but ultimately lost. The sinking of Lexington gave Japan a momentary sense of triumph, but the cancellation of Port Moresby erased those gains. The Allies, though bloodied, had achieved their core objective, keeping Australia secure and halting Japan's expansion. This duality makes the battle one of the most fascinating contests of the Pacific War. Its outcome demonstrated that war is measured not only by losses inflicted, but by goals achieved. Coral Sea set the stage for Midway, where the lessons of strategy and intelligence would pay dividends. It proved that Japan was not invincible, that Allied planning could blunt even the most ambitious offensives. For sailors and pilots, the victory was paid for in lives and ships, but it carried meaning beyond loss. Coral Sea was therefore both a tragedy and a triumph. It marked the moment when Japan's expansion met its first immovable obstacle. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May 1942, had immediate consequences that extended far beyond its tactical results. Just 4 weeks later, the Imperial Japanese Navy would commit to its ambitious strike on Midway, and the wounds from Coral Sea had not healed. The carrier Shōkaku was gone, the first Japanese carrier lost in the war, and Shōkaku was heavily damaged, requiring lengthy repairs. Meanwhile, Shōkaku, though undamaged, had suffered the loss of the bulk of its air group, leaving it combat ineffective. This meant that only 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, and Hiryo, could be sent into battle at Midway. The absence of Shōkaku and Shōkaku critically reduced Japan's margin of superiority. For Admiral Yamamoto, this was not simply a numerical loss, but a blow to flexibility and operational strength. Carriers were the crown jewels of naval power, and losing 2 from an engagement just before Midway could not be ignored. The Coral Sea thus became an unanticipated prelude to disaster. Its ripples shaped the Pacific War's turning point. Japan's original Midway plan had envisioned overwhelming force, using 6 fleet carriers to annihilate the American Pacific Fleet. That strategy relied on carriers striking with precision, overwhelming any opposition, and then forcing decisive battle. Yet Coral Sea reduced this fleet by 1/3, undermining Yamamoto's vision before the first plane launched at Midway. The loss of Shōkaku was symbolic, showing that Japanese carriers could be hunted and destroyed, while the damage to Shōkaku was operationally crippling. Aircrews from Shōkaku, depleted by Coral Sea losses, could not be replaced in time. Japanese training systems were lengthy, and the attrition of elite aviators could not be easily reversed. As a result, the Japanese entered Midway with fewer carriers, fewer planes, and fewer experienced pilots. By contrast, the Americans repaired Yorktown in record time, returning it to combat readiness despite severe damage. The imbalance of preparation between Coral Sea and Midway tilted the scales. Strategic momentum was beginning to shift. Coral Sea also shaped the psychology of both navies in profound ways. For the Japanese, the engagement was unsettling because it showed the Americans were not passive defenders. The US Navy had demonstrated an ability to project power and to challenge Japan's offensives with skill and daring. Though Japan celebrated Lexington's sinking, the cancelled Port Moresby invasion revealed limitations. For the Americans, Coral Sea was a morale booster, showing that intelligence, boldness, and sacrifice could stop the seemingly unstoppable. It provided lessons in coordination between carriers, reconnaissance, and the value of timing. Pilots and sailors who survived Coral Sea carried hard-earned experience into Midway. Their knowledge of Japanese tactics, formations, and weaknesses became a valuable asset. Thus, the battle was not only about attrition, but about learning. The road to Midway was paved with Coral Sea's lessons. Intelligence played a decisive role in both battles, and Coral Sea confirmed the value of American codebreaking. Station HYPO's cryptographers had given Admiral Nimitz the edge by predicting Japanese movements toward Port Moresby. Their success emboldened the use of signals intelligence at Midway, where deception tactics confirmed the Japanese target. Without Coral Sea as proof of concept, American commanders might have doubted their reliance on cryptographic breakthroughs. The accuracy of intelligence gave the Americans confidence to take risks at Midway. It also exposed Japanese complacency in communication security, a vulnerability they did not correct. By May 1942, the Allies realized that intelligence was as decisive as ships and planes. Coral Sea's outcome reinforced that information warfare could alter grand strategy. The confidence gained from Coral Sea's intelligence work became a foundation for the ambush at Midway. Knowledge more than numbers shaped the outcome. The reduced Japanese carrier strength at Midway was not merely about hulls, but about the ecosystem of naval aviation. Carriers relied on skilled aircrews, coordination between squadrons, and experienced deck crews who could launch, recover, and rearm aircraft quickly. Coral Sea had drained this system, destroying irreplaceable pilots and stressing logistical networks. Japan's inability to recover quickly highlighted structural weaknesses in its naval organization. The US, meanwhile, showed remarkable adaptability, restoring Yorktown in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor's dry dock. That feat of engineering meant the Americans could field 3 carriers at Midway against Japan's 4. Though numerically inferior, they faced a weakened opponent. Coral Sea had altered the balance in subtle but critical ways. The Americans now fought with renewed confidence, while the Japanese carried unseen vulnerabilities. These cracks widened at Midway into catastrophic defeat. Coral Sea also revealed shifting dynamics of naval warfare. For the first time, fleets had engaged without ships sighting each other, fighting entirely through carrier-based air power. This precedent framed expectations for Midway, where airstrikes would again determine victory or defeat. Both sides studied the Coral Sea encounter to refine tactics. The Japanese believed their formations had been effective, but they underestimated the cost of losing carriers and aircrews. The Americans, though suffering heavily, recognized the value of coordination between dive bombers and torpedo squadrons. They also understood the risks of piecemeal attacks, lessons they would apply more effectively at Midway. The battle's experimental nature made it a rehearsal for the greater clash to come. Coral Sea was therefore not just a fight for territory, but a laboratory for modern naval doctrine. Midway would be its ultimate test. Strategically, Coral Sea forced Japan to accelerate its plans for Midway with diminished resources. Yamamoto sought a decisive blow before the Americans could recover their losses. Yet, ironically, Coral Sea had shown that American resilience was greater than expected. Yorktown's return to battle was proof of industrial capacity and determination. Japan's overconfidence hardened by early victories, blinded them to these realities. The weakened carrier force, combined with flawed assumptions, set the stage for disaster. Coral Sea thus became the unseen hand guiding Midway's outcome. It ensured Japan fought the decisive battle from a position of weakness. The first cracks in Japanese naval supremacy had appeared. They would break wide open in June 1942. In hindsight, the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway form a single chapter in the Pacific War. Coral Sea was the warning, Midway the catastrophe. The first halted Japan's expansion and prevented Port Moresby's capture. The second destroyed the core of Japan's carrier fleet. Coral Sea weakened Japanese strength, just enough to shift the balance in June. Without it, Midway might have been fought with 6 Japanese carriers instead of 4. That difference could have changed the war's trajectory entirely. Coral Sea demonstrated the limits of Japan's reach, while Midway confirmed its vulnerability. Together, they marked the end of unchecked Japanese momentum. The Coral Sea was therefore not an isolated battle, but a prelude to one of history's most decisive victories. Its legacy lies in how it opened the road to Midway. The Battle of the Coral Sea holds a unique place in military history as the first major naval engagement fought entirely by aircraft carriers. For the first time, opposing fleets never came within visual range of each other, and no ship-based artillery duel decided the outcome. Aircraft launched from carriers carried the destructive power across hundreds of miles of open ocean, striking targets unseen by their own crews. This innovation demonstrated that the age of the battleship had given way to the age of naval aviation. It was a turning point not because of territorial conquest, but because it redefined how naval wars would be fought. Admirals and strategists around the world took notice, understanding that future conflicts would hinge on control of the skies over the seas. The lessons of Coral Sea echoed beyond World War II into Cold War planning and beyond. It showed that intelligence, air cover, and carrier coordination would matter more than sheer numbers of capital ships. Naval warfare had crossed a threshold it would never retreat from. The Coral Sea became the dawn of modern naval combat. The battle also introduced the world to the fragile balance of power between aircraft carriers and their air groups. Unlike battleships which could withstand shellfire and continue fighting, carriers were dependent on their ability to launch, recover, and protect aircraft. Once a carrier's deck was damaged or its planes destroyed, its power evaporated instantly. The loss of the Japanese light carrier Shōkaku and the crippling of Shōkaku highlighted this vulnerability. Conversely, the rapid American repair of Yorktown showed the resilience of a nation capable of sustaining carrier operations under pressure. At Coral Sea, every airstrike became a gamble with immense consequences, and survival depended on reconnaissance, timing, and luck. This dependency shaped all future carrier battles, including Midway, Leyte Gulf, and the Philippine Sea. The Coral Sea provided the first practical demonstration of how fragile yet decisive carrier warfare could be. It altered not just tactics but the strategic imagination of all navies. From that point on, carriers were the queens of the ocean chessboard. In strategic terms, the Coral Sea was a paradox of outcomes, blending tactical loss with strategic victory for the Allies. The US Navy lost more tonnage and a valuable fleet carrier in Lexington, while Yorktown limped away battered and in need of urgent repair. Yet Japan's failure to seize Port Moresby meant the larger strategic goal of threatening Australia collapsed. This denial of a stepping stone toward cutting off Allied supply lines was the true measure of the battle's importance. It shifted Japanese momentum, forcing them into increasingly desperate gambles. The clash revealed that the Japanese Navy, while formidable, was not invincible. It emboldened Allied planners and boosted morale across the Pacific theater. For Australia, the battle was a shield, preserving its role as a crucial base of operations. Thus, the Coral Sea stood as a reminder that strategic outcomes outweighed tactical counts of sunk or damaged vessels. Its legacy was measured in preserved futures, not just sunken hulls. The Coral Sea also influenced the psychological dimension of the war. For Japan, the battle brought the first real setback after months of sweeping victories from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. The image of an unstoppable Japanese juggernaut faltered, replaced by the recognition of vulnerability. For the Americans, the battle restored belief in their ability to confront and check Japan's expansion. Newspapers across the United States hailed the victory, even as they acknowledged the heavy losses. The rallying cry "Scratch one flat top" became symbolic of the shift in spirit. For Australian civilians, the battle meant survival and relief, protecting their northern approaches. In Tokyo, the leadership masked the setback with propaganda, but privately acknowledged the frustration. The confidence with which Japan had extended its empire began to erode. Coral Sea was not just a naval engagement, but a turning point in morale for both sides. It altered how the Pacific War was perceived at home and abroad. From a technological perspective, the battle validated new tools of war, particularly signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. Codebreaking at Pearl Harbor had allowed Admiral Nimitz to anticipate Japanese moves and place carriers in their path. This was a revolution in modern warfare, where information became as decisive as firepower. Aerial reconnaissance, though prone to error, guided strikes and shaped the rhythm of combat. The Coral Sea exposed the challenges of identifying targets correctly, as mistaken reports influenced Japanese and American decisions. At the same time, it underscored the necessity of long-range scouting, radar coordination, and fast communication. These lessons directly influenced Midway, where intelligence and reconnaissance delivered crushing success. The Coral Sea thus became a proving ground for fusing technology, intelligence, and naval aviation into one doctrine. The war had entered an era where data streams and aerial eyes determined survival. It was a transformation that forever reshaped battle planning. In geopolitical terms, the Coral Sea cemented the US-Australian alliance in blood and sacrifice. Australians recognized that American carriers had fought and bled to defend their homeland from imminent invasion. This forged bonds that extended beyond strategy into trust and cooperation. Australian ports and bases became vital hubs for the American war effort, and Coral Sea symbolized that partnership. For the Japanese, the failure to isolate Australia meant a permanent thorn in their side. It guaranteed that Allied counteroffensives could be launched from southern staging grounds. This altered the trajectory of the entire Pacific campaign, ensuring Japan would face resistance from both east and south. Coral Sea was therefore a battle not just of ships and planes, but of continents and alliances. Its legacy rippled through political relationships long after the war ended. It ensured Australia remained central to Allied strategy for the remainder of the conflict. The Coral Sea also entered naval tradition as a case study in the unpredictability of war. Both sides entered with confidence, but errors, intelligence breakthroughs, and sheer luck shaped the final outcome. The Japanese believed they had superiority, yet underestimated the endurance of American resolve and the effect of attrition. The Americans risked their remaining carriers and came away bloodied but strategically triumphant. This unpredictability became the hallmark of naval aviation, where a single bomb or torpedo could reverse fortunes instantly. The loss of Lexington was tragic, but the crippling of Shōkaku had even greater long-term weight. Historians view Coral Sea as a lesson in balancing risk and reward in carrier warfare. It also taught that victory could be measured in denied objectives, not just destroyed fleets. The battle's narrative continues to shape military academies' teachings today. Its lessons remain alive in the doctrine of every modern navy. Ultimately, the legacy of the Battle of the Coral Sea lies in its role as a watershed moment in naval history. It ended Japanese momentum, preserved Australia, and paved the way for Midway's decisive victory. It demonstrated that aircraft carriers were the future of naval warfare, and that intelligence could offset numerical disadvantage. It bound allies together and lifted morale in a dark phase of the war. It also marked the first time Japan's aura of invincibility cracked under determined opposition. The Coral Sea became not just a battle, but a symbol of resilience, adaptation, and strategic foresight. It remains remembered as the clash that forever changed the seas. Its story lives on in commemorations, in naval doctrine, and in the heritage of nations it saved. For historians, it is the hinge upon which the Pacific War began to swing. For sailors, it is the eternal reminder that the tide can turn with courage and sacrifice. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended not with the decisive sinking of fleets, but with lessons that would echo throughout the Pacific War. It showed that wars are not always won in dramatic victories, but sometimes in preventing enemy success. By halting Japan's advance toward Port Moresby, the Allies gained precious breathing room and preserved a crucial base of operations. The battle highlighted that strategy could outweigh tactics, as even a costly engagement could yield greater long-term benefits. The courage of sailors and airmen, many of whom never returned, underscored the price of this turning point. Intelligence, once considered secondary, was proven to be a weapon in its own right, shaping outcomes before shots were fired. The Coral Sea taught that information and anticipation were as decisive as bombs and torpedoes. It showed that survival in modern war depended on a fusion of courage, brains, and sacrifice. Above all, the battle demonstrated that the tide of war could begin to shift through perseverance. It became the first step on the road to ultimate Allied dominance in the Pacific. One of the greatest lessons of Coral Sea was the power of intelligence. American cryptographers, working in dimly lit rooms at Pearl Harbor's Station Hatay-Po, had cracked enough of Japan's naval codes to foresee the strike. This allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers in anticipation, a daring act of faith in his codebreakers. It proved that in the new era of warfare, secrets could be deadlier than guns. Every intercepted message carried the weight of thousands of lives and millions of tons of shipping. The Coral Sea validated intelligence as the cornerstone of modern strategy, paving the way for Midway's triumph. Without codebreaking, the Allied fleet would have sailed blind into destruction. With it, they turned the vast Pacific into a chessboard where moves could be predicted and countered. The Allies now knew that control of information was as vital as control of the seas. Coral Sea etched that truth in blood and sacrifice. Courage stood as the second pillar of Coral Sea's legacy. American torpedo squadrons hurled themselves into the teeth of Japanese fighters, often annihilated before striking a blow. Their sacrifice, though costly, drew enemy aircraft away from the bombers that later dealt decisive hits. Pilots launched into missions, knowing their odds of return were slim, yet they flew with determination born of duty. Sailors on the Lexington and Yorktown battled fires and explosions with grit, saving lives even as ships groaned beneath them. Japanese aviators, equally brave, pressed home attacks with unmatched skill and discipline. Courage was not confined to one side, but shared by all who entered the deadly arena of carrier warfare. In the Coral Sea, bravery was measured in minutes of defiance, in bombs dropped against overwhelming odds, and in lives given to delay an enemy strike. The courage of these men left a legacy that cannot be measured in statistics. It endures as the human face of a battle shaped by sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Coral Sea extended beyond ships and aircraft. It reached into the futures denied to those who fought. More than 600 Americans and around 1,000 Japanese never saw another sunrise, their lives claimed by sea and sky. Each casualty represented a family left in mourning, and a generation scarred by absence. The Lexington's loss was not only of steel and machinery, but of the sailors who gave their all to keep her afloat until the end. For Japan, the death of aircrews who had trained for years meant an irreplaceable loss of experience. Sacrifice also meant endurance by survivors, carrying memories of horror through the rest of their lives. The battle's toll became the price of a greater strategy, a grim reminder that progress in war often comes at unbearable cost. It was sacrifice that bought time, space, and hope for the Allies. These lives, extinguished in fire and salt water, became the foundation of victory yet to come. Coral Sea remains a memorial written across the ocean itself. Another vital lesson from Coral Sea was the importance of adaptability. Neither side had ever fought a full carrier battle before, and both learned in the crucible of combat. The Americans discovered the value of coordination between carriers, escorts, and reconnaissance planes. The Japanese learned the fragility of operating far from resupply, where damaged carriers meant strategic paralysis. Both sides recognized that aircraft carriers were now the primary weapons of naval war, overshadowing battleships once thought supreme. Coral Sea forced rapid adjustments in doctrine, communication, and logistics. It revealed that survival required learning faster than the enemy, adapting not just to successes but to costly failures. By Midway, those lessons would shape American strategy and tilt the balance of war. The Coral Sea thus became a classroom where innovation was forged in fire. Its legacy lies in teaching that wars are won by those who adapt quickest to new realities. The battle also reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific. Though both fleets claimed victories, the Japanese withdrawal revealed their failure to achieve their true objective. Australia remained secure, Allied supply lines remained intact, and Japan had lost a chance to cut the Allies off from a crucial partner. At the same time, two of Japan's frontline carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, were rendered unavailable for Midway. This absence crippled Japanese strength at the decisive battle that followed. The Coral Sea, therefore, was not an isolated clash, but a stepping stone to greater victories. It weakened Japan at the very moment the Allies needed it most. It also gave the United States the confidence to fight back on equal terms. Strategically, Coral Sea was less about immediate results and more about shaping the course of the war. Its power lay in altering the future balance, tilting it toward eventual Allied triumph. For historians, Coral Sea remains a case study in how small margins decide great wars. A few hours' delay, a mistaken report, or a lucky hit altered the course of the battle. The fog of war, compounded by the vastness of the Pacific, made every decision fraught with uncertainty. Yet within this uncertainty lay the seeds of Allied momentum. Coral Sea showed that even imperfect victories could shape history when leveraged properly. It illustrated that wars are not a string of perfect triumphs, but a mosaic of costly battles where meaning lies in the whole, not the parts. Students of strategy still examine the battle for its lessons in intelligence, timing, and risk. Coral Sea has become a permanent chapter in the textbooks of naval warfare. It remains one of the most studied clashes because of what it taught, not merely what it destroyed. Its legacy lies as much in its uncertainties as in its outcomes. Ultimately, the Battle of the Coral Sea was more than a clash of ships and planes. It was a turning of the tide in the Pacific War. It marked the first time Japan's expansion was checked, and the first time Allied strategy bent the arc of war in their favor. The battle revealed the importance of intelligence, the necessity of courage, and the price of sacrifice. It set the stage for Midway, where the weakened Japanese fleet would face annihilation. For Australia, it meant survival and continued partnership in the Allied cause. For America, it meant resilience and the beginning of a comeback that would end in Tokyo Bay. For Japan, it was the warning that their empire's reach had begun to exceed its grasp. The Coral Sea lives on as a testament to those who fought, died, and endured for a cause greater than themselves. Its lessons remain etched in naval history, in memorials, and in the memories of nations. It was the first real sign that the Pacific War could and would be won.